I opened Helen's cookbook because Sunday evening still required one honest thing of me. And the first thing I saw was not the casserole page, but a photograph sliding loose from between the paper-thin leaves. It struck the counter face up. My son was standing in the picture with a woman we had buried 9 years ago. For a second, I thought the kitchen light had gone wrong on me. It was nearly 5 that bluish winter hour when the windows over the sink stop reflecting the yard and start reflecting the room itself, so that a man can catch sight of his own shoulders moving in the glass and mistake them for someone waiting outside. The oven had just clicked on behind me. I could smell chicken skin warming on the platter and the dry, sweet dust of paprika I had tapped into my palm. The dishwasher hummed in its old, tired way. Nothing in the room belonged to shock. It was a Sunday the same as other Sundays had been since Helen died, which was exactly why the photograph frightened me the way it did. Grief had made me superstitious in small domestic ways. Not about ghosts. I am too old for the kinds of nonsense that help people avoid the harder facts. But I had become careful around certain objects. The blue sugar bowl with the hairline crack. Helen's dish towels folded in thirds instead of halves. The little brass timer she trusted more than the digital one on the microwave because, as she used to say, a thing that ticks at you has a conscience. And the cookbook, especially the cookbook. It was a fat, spiral-bound church cookbook from 1998 with a laminate cover that had once been cream and was now the color of old paper. Our town's Presbyterian women had printed it as a fundraiser before people started pretending casseroles were beneath them and before every recipe in America got upgraded with a photograph and a story about your grandmother. This one had no photographs, just names under recipes. Doris Hanley's beef noodle bake, Irene Pike's lemon icebox pie, Helen Avery's winter chicken and rice, tomato aspic and pineapple casserole in 6 versions of funeral potatoes because in Ohio there are some meals people never admit they love except when grief gives them permission. The cover curled at one corner where steam had lifted it over the years. There was a brown thumbprint at the edge of the soups section and a page in the breads chapter stuck faintly from some old spill of corn syrup or honey. Helen wrote in it the way some women annotate books and some men mark up fishing maps. Dates in the corners, little substitutions, a slanting pencil note that said, "Ben hated cloves, even though we did not know a Ben anymore." Another one that said, "Too much time ruins it after the first day." She was a person who trusted memory less than evidence, though I had not understood that fully while she was alive. Back then, I just thought she was organized. After she died, I used the cookbook the way a child uses an heirloom quilt, less for utility than for proof that hands I loved had once moved here. Every Sunday, I chose something she had made in winter because winter was when the house sounded most like itself. The radiators clicked, the back storm door shuddered on windy nights. The pantry stayed colder than the rest of the first floor. And the kitchen carried smells that did not seem embarrassed to linger. Onion, flour, bread crust, celery softening in butter. Human smells, trustworthy smells. I still had paprika on my palm when I reached down and picked up the photograph. It was not large. 4x6 drugstore print glossy enough to catch the under-cabinet light. The image had that slightly washed-out look pictures sometimes get when they've been handled a few times or printed from an older phone. Caleb was maybe 28 in it, which put the picture about 10 years ago, give or take. He was standing outside somewhere at night, shoulders lifted against the cold, one hand in the pocket of a dark coat I knew he used to wear before he moved downtown and started buying cleaner, sharper things. Beside him stood Nora Bell. I knew her as surely as I knew my own son's face. Not from the many years she'd been in our lives, she had not had that many years, but from the way some people arrive at the exact age your child still thinks love can save him and remain fixed there forever. Nora had a broad, unafraid smile, dark hair cut bluntly just below the jaw, and eyes that always gave you the impression she had come into the room mid-thought and would leave before you finished your sentence. Caleb had loved her in that helpless, furious, all-weather way young men do once and then spend the rest of their lives either honoring or disguising. She was wearing a red wool coat in the photograph. That is what I noticed after the faces. Not the fact of her being there beside him. My mind resisted that at first, the way it resists stepping onto ice you know is too thin. But the coat. Bright red collar turned up one hand against Caleb's sleeve. It was not a coat I remembered her owning when she died. Nora had lived in charcoal denim olive green. That was one of the first ridiculous facts grief left behind color preferences. The dead survived in the living mind in sweaters and coffee orders, and whether they tilted their chair back too far. It was the sort of detail that should have made the picture feel less dangerous. Instead, it made it worse. A lie in the wrong color is more frightening than a lie in the right one. I set the paprika down in a little rust-colored mound on the butcher block and looked at the photograph again. The kitchen around me seemed to step back. Our house is a 1941 brick colonial on a quiet street in Worthington, the kind with a center hall and room that still believe in doors. The kitchen sits at the back, not large but intelligently shaped, widened sometime in the 70s by people who understood counters better than they understood beauty. The cabinets are painted a soft yellow. Helen chose because, as she once told the man at the hardware store, white made a kitchen look too eager to please. There is a double window over the sink that looks out on the side yard and the small rectangle of flagstone path leading to the detached garage. In summer, you can see the neighbors' hydrangeas leaning over the fence like they're listening. In winter, you get bare branches, the gray clapboard of the garage, and whatever weather is kind enough to tell the truth. That evening, the yard was already slipping into dark. The bare maple by the garage looked like black veins against a low sky. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once indignant and then stopped. The refrigerator motor kicked on, and the old clock above the mudroom door carried on with its minute hand like there was still a world where time behaved. I turned the photograph over. Nothing on the back. No date, no lab stamp. Just a faint thumb smear near one corner and the soft abrasion of having been slid in and out of paper. I looked at the cookbook on the counter. It was open to winter chicken and rice, Helen's version, not the printed one. The printed recipe called for canned cream of mushroom soup and crushed crackers on top because nobody trusted freshness in 1998. Helen had crossed half of it out over the years and written her own instructions in the margins. Use broth and milk. Sauté celery separately. Rice under, not mixed. The page was stiff where steam had hit it over time. Near the top of the right-hand page in her neat slanted pencil was a notation I had seen 100 times and never thought about. First, made this after Nora's service. Caleb ate 2 helpings. February 11th. I stood there with the photograph in one hand and the cookbook open in front of me, and something inside me that had been sleeping since the funeral years of our life sat upright. Nora's burial had been on February 3rd. I knew that as surely as I knew my own birthday. There are dates a family carries like scars. February 3rd was one of ours, a Saturday. Wet snow in the morning, freezing rain by noon. The roads ugly and everyone wearing that particular stiff sorrow people wear when the dead are too young and the old are afraid to look at the parents. Caleb, 29 days shy of turning 20. Nora gone after the crash on 315. Helen, wearing her black coat with the missing lower button and gripping my arm hard enough during the service that I had bruises along the inside of my sleeve when I got home and changed. February 3rd. I looked again at Helen's note. First made this after Nora's service. Caleb ate 2 helpings. February 11th. Maybe she meant a memorial supper after. Maybe she wrote the date later and meant the first time she remade it. Maybe grief did what grief does and slid 1 week over another until what mattered was not when but who came to the table and managed to swallow food. Those explanations arrived fast and thin and ready. I almost accepted them. I am a history teacher by profession and by temperament. I have spent most of my life distrusting the first explanation for things. But grief trains even careful people to be sloppy where it hurts them most. It tells you the heart deserves a little imprecision. Then I noticed Helen's blue mechanical pencil. It was still tucked in the spiral at the top of the book, exactly where she used to leave it, eraser worn down to a blunt pink coin. I had not seen it there in weeks. I had thought it was lost in one of the junk drawers or carried off in a grocery bag when we cleaned after she died. The sight of it caught at me harder than the date had. Her pencil, the one she used for grocery margins and guest counts, and the small corrective notes she made in cookbooks, calendars, and those ridiculous little weather pocket diaries she kept until 2017 and then pretended she was too modern for. Helen's handwriting had always been the handwriting of a woman who considered vagueness a personal insult. I sat down at the kitchen table with the photograph and the open cookbook in front of me and let the oven tick away behind me. For the first 4 months after Helen died, I could not sit at that table without feeling watched by absence. She had spent too many years there, sorting mail, paying bills, writing Christmas cards with her tongue pressed faintly to one corner of her mouth when a name required thought. Resting her forearms on the table after her treatments made her tired, and pretending she had just sat down for a minute, when we both knew she no longer had the strength to stand through all the tasks she used to do automatically. Toward the end, she kept a folded dish towel under one elbow because the wood hurt her skin. The painful memory came back then, not because I invited it, but because the cookbook had already unlatched something. It was one of her last decent evenings in the kitchen. November, the year before she died. Rain on the windows, the sort of warm dark that makes yellow cabinets look richer than they are. She had insisted on making bread, even though kneading tired her out. I stood beside her chopping onions for soup, trying to look helpful instead of worried, which was the specialty of the men in my family. She had stopped halfway through shaping the second loaf and leaned both hands on the counter. Not dramatically, not like a woman in a film about courage, but like an irritated person pausing because her body had become less cooperative than the task deserved. "Sit down," I told her. "In a minute. You've been in a minute all month." That made her laugh, though it came out thinner than it should have. She looked at the cookbook, then at the little square paper where she had written yeast times and oven temperature, and said, "Tom, if anything ever goes wrong in this house after I'm gone, don't trust what people remember first. Trust what they repeated." I looked up from the onion. What does that mean? It means memory likes a dramatic entrance. Routine tells the truth slower. I thought then that she was speaking generally the way people near the end sometimes do, trying to leave behind usable wisdom in place of all the useless love nobody can spend. I kissed her temple and told her she sounded like an old detective. She gave me one of those looks wives give men they have already forgiven for not understanding something in time. Now, sitting alone at the table with Nora Bell smiling out of a photograph she should not have existed inside, I felt those words come back not as comfort, but as indictment. The oven timer clicked. I got up, automatically turned it off, then turned the oven off entirely. The chicken and rice could wait. Hunger had left the room. I carried the photograph into the den because that was where the family memorial things lived now, not because Helen had wanted them there. If Helen had had her way, photographs would have stayed spread through the house as they always had ordinary, and mixed among the living. But after her funeral, people brought frames and memorial albums and mass cards and sympathy pieces with scripture stitched on them, and I had not known where to put any of it. So the den acquired a shelf and then another. The den was where grief went in our house when we needed it to look contained. The room sits off the center hall at the front left of the house and is more handsome than comfortable, which is true of many American dens, designed by men who wanted a room for reading that also implied authority. Built-in shelves, darker wood trim than the rest of the first floor. 2 windows looking toward the street, one green leather chair I had inherited from my father and never quite liked. A wool rug, Helen said, looked like a map of somewhere people had suffered on horseback. The room always held the smell of paper old lamp heat and whatever weather had collected in coats hung by the front door. I did not switch the overhead light on. I used the standing lamp by the chair and let the rest of the room stay in corners. The memorial shelf along the far built-in looked as it always did. Helen's framed photograph from our daughter-in-law's wedding, her head turned a little because someone had said her name just before the shutter. The little ceramic cardinal from Ruth and Kevin. The sympathy card from the history department still propped behind a brass candlestick because I had never found a better place for it. And further down in the separate cluster that had remained for years before Helen died, the small silver frame with Nora's graduation picture in it. I picked it up. Nora in the silver frame looked younger than the woman in the photograph from the cookbook, though not by many years. Same eyes, same broad mouth, no red coat, no hand on Caleb's sleeve. Graduation robe mortarboard held against one hip, July light on her hair. On the back of the frame, someone had once stuck a tiny white label with a black date in Helen's hand, summer 2006. I set it back down and looked along the shelf again the way you might scan faces in a crowd after someone says a thing you cannot unsay. Everything appeared in order. That was the trouble. Too much in order. It struck me suddenly that grief displays are rarely honest when they become permanent. They settle into the version most likely to spare the living. I took the photograph from my pocket and held it near Nora's framed graduation picture. It was the same woman. I was not imagining that much. But the new photograph had a different atmosphere to it. Night instead of summer. The closeness between her and Caleb, not formal, not posed the way memorial photographs usually are when families use them later. It had the casual intimacy of a moment taken by somebody who expected everyone in it to go on living. I heard myself say softly to no one, "No." Then I did what people do when the impossible arrives in the middle of a respectable life. I called my son. Caleb answered on the fourth ring, sounding distracted in the way men in offices sound when they have looked at a screen too long and want to pretend their own voice belongs to a calmer person. "Hey, Dad, are you still at work?" "Sort of." "Why?" I looked down at the photograph in my hand. "I've got a question." Silence for a beat. "That sounds promising." "I was making dinner. I opened your mother's cookbook." "All right." "There was a photograph inside." He said nothing. "Of you," I went on. "With Nora." Something changed in the silence then. Not words, not breathing exactly. Just the feeling on the line that another person had sat down somewhere farther back inside himself. "Dad," he said after a moment, "what kind of photograph?" "Outside. Nighttime. You're in that old charcoal coat you used to wear. She's in a red coat." Another silence. Longer this time. "Caleb, I don't know what you mean." I almost told him to spare me that. Instead, I said, "You know exactly what I mean. Do you want to come over?" He exhaled. "No, not right now. Then explain it." "I can't explain a picture I haven't seen." "That's a lawyer's answer." "I'm not a lawyer." "No, but you've learned the bad parts of talking like one." That landed. I had not meant to sound sharp so quickly, or perhaps I had and only regretted hearing it aloud. Caleb and I had spent the better part of the last decade speaking to each other like two men sharing a train compartment, polite, brief, careful not to let our knees touch. There had been no one moment that caused that. Just accumulation. Nora's death. His leaving for college and then not really returning. My way of trying to help, which often resembled supervision. His way of needing distance, which often resembled contempt to a father if the father was feeling less generous than he should. "Dad," he said finally, "you know things were bad back then. That isn't an explanation. I'm saying memory gets ugly around trauma." The word trauma in his mouth irritated me in ways I know I should be above by now. Not because it was wrong. It was probably the right word, but because people his age used it sometimes as if naming a wound finished the work of living with it. I looked again at the picture. Was this taken after Nora died Jesus? That's a simple question. No, it isn't. I pulled a chair out in the den and sat down, photograph in one hand, phone in the other. Helen's memorial shelf, watching from 6 feet away like a jury of one. "Then tell me why your mother would have hidden it in her cookbook." At that, he went quiet again, but the quiet was different. Not defensive this time. Disturbed. "What cookbook?" he asked. "Helen's church cookbook, the one she always used." He knew the one. Every child knows the objects their mother used, so often they became part of the architecture. "I don't know," he said. "No. No, you sound like you do. What do you want from me tonight?" There are questions that reveal more than answers do. I stood up suddenly, unable to sit in the den another minute, and walked back into the kitchen with the phone still at my ear. The room had cooled in the time I'd been gone. The mound of paprika on the counter looked almost brown now in the fading light. I switched on the under-cabinet lamps, and the pale yellow cabinet paint grew warm again, stubbornly domestic. "What I want," I said, "is for one thing in this family to make sense when I look at it." He was quiet, then said very flatly, "That picture shouldn't be there." I stopped moving. "What does that mean?" "It means it shouldn't be in the house." "That is not the same thing." "No." "Caleb, I have to go." "Don't." But he was already gone. I stood there listening to the deadline until it began its ugly little mechanical click. Then I set the phone down and looked at Helen's cookbook again. If you have lived in the same house for 35 years, you can feel when it changes temperature emotionally, even if the thermostat says otherwise. The kitchen had not become sinister. I do not care for that modern habit of talking about rooms as if they carry intentions. Rooms carry habits, not intentions, but something in the balance of the house had shifted. The den now felt too carefully arranged, the kitchen too full of unexamined witness, the center hall between them like a corridor in a courthouse where one room contained testimony and the other a curated exhibit. I opened the cookbook to the page before the casserole and then the one after it. Helen's notes were there as usual. Adjusted butter amount. Better with fresh parsley if Ruth coming. Caleb says too salty, ignore him. On the back of the page after that, at the corner of a noodle dish recipe she rarely made, there was another note. Mara brought cards on Monday. Put extras in bread tin. I looked toward the top of the refrigerator where the old enamel bread tin sat. White with a blue rim chipped along the front edge lid, slightly warped so it never quite shut. We had stopped keeping bread in it years ago because nobody in America keeps bread the way houses used to. It had become a place for things that wanted a lid but not importance. Cookie cutters, birthday candles, sealed yeast packets, receipts for appliances no one intended to return, and apparently condolence cards. I carried the bread tin down to the table. Inside, under a bag of stale sesame crackers and a roll of butcher's twine, was a stack of sympathy cards tied with one of Helen's faded yellow ribbons. My throat tightened a little just at the sight of it. That was Helen exactly. Even grief got ribbon if it was going to live in her kitchen. I untied the bundle and spread the cards out. Most were what you would expect. Flowers on the front, script that looked too soft for bad news. Messages from people who meant well, and from a few who did not know us well enough to mean much at all. Several were from when Helen died last year. Those I set aside. Underneath them were older cards, the paper slightly more yellowed, the sentiments written in younger hands. For Nora, for Caleb, for the Bell family. We were thinking of all of you. Such a terrible loss. Call if you need anything. Thinking of you on Tuesday. I'm so sorry. I went through them more carefully. The postmarks mattered. I decided, though, I could not have said yet why they mattered exactly. Helen had written, "Put extras in bread tin," as if it were merely storage, but after the photograph and the date in the cookbook, storage no longer felt neutral. February 4th. February 5th. February 2nd from Columbus. One undated because the stamp had smudged. Another from out of state that had arrived too late to matter to the funeral, but not too late to matter to the family. I made piles without meaning to. A teacher's instinct. Sort. Sequence. Compare. Then one card stopped me. It was plain cream expensive paper, no flowers. From Mara Vance. I recognized her handwriting before I opened it. Mara had been Helen's friend since the boys were in middle school and the sort of woman churches ran on while pretending ministers mattered more. She handled bulletins, meal lists, flowers, the soft mechanical labor of communal decency. The envelope had been slit neatly with Helen's letter opener. The postmark was February 10th. Inside, Mara had written in her narrow, careful script, "Helen, thinking of you all and of Sunday night. I hope the chicken casserole sat well with Caleb. I know food can feel foolish next to grief, but sitting at your table did him good. Call me tomorrow when the house is quiet. Sunday night." I checked the calendar in my head before I checked anything else. February 10th had been a Sunday that year. I sat very still. Nora's burial had been February 3rd, a Saturday. That much I knew, as one knows weather that changed the shape of a family. If Mara's card had been mailed on Monday the February the 10th, then Sunday night had been February 9th. The night before the card. The night she was referring to. The night Helen had apparently served chicken casserole and Caleb had sat at our table. After the burial. I looked back at Helen's cookbook. First made this after Nora's service. Caleb ate 2 helpings. February 11th. My pulse was loud enough now that I could hear it in my ears, which always annoys me because it feels like a body trying to add drama to a situation that has already earned enough on its own. I picked up my phone and called Mara. She answered almost at once, as if she had been near the phone or had my name in her hand already. Tom Mara. Her tone changed at the sound of mine. "What is it?" I looked at the card again. "Thinking of you all and of Sunday night." "I found something in Helen's cookbook," I said. Silence. Mara. "What did you find?" "A photograph. Caleb with Nora." I swallowed. "And one of your cards. The one about Sunday night and chicken casserole." When she spoke again, her voice had gone thin around the edges, as if she were trying to keep it from tearing. "Tom, don't ask Caleb anything else yet." That made me stand up. "Why not?" "Please." "Why?" "Look at the dates first." I stared at the card in my hand. "I am looking at the dates." "No," she said. And now there was a kind of desperate patience in her voice I had never heard from her before. "I mean, really look at them. Don't trust what anyone says right away, not even me. Look at the dates." "Mara, what are you talking about?" A pause. I could hear paper moving on her end, maybe keys, maybe receipts, something small and nervous in her hands. "I should have said something years ago," she said. "Said what? I don't know exactly what I saw. That's the truth. And I won't pretend I know more than I do. But there were things that didn't sit right. Around then. Around the funeral and after. Little things. I let myself think grief was making everybody strange. My grip tightened on the card hard enough to bend one corner. What little things, Tom? No. She exhaled shakily. Not on the phone. Not tonight. You need to look through Helen's notes first. If she kept that picture there, she wanted you to start there. Start. The word hit me colder than the rest. My eyes moved from the card to the cookbook to the dark window over the sink where my own reflection stood with a piece of cream stationery in one hand and looked suddenly like a man late to his own life. Mara, I said quietly. Did Helen know something? Another silence. But not empty this time. A silence full of moral weather. I think she said carefully, Helen trusted repetition more than memory, and I think she got worried about what I don't know enough to say it cleanly. Her voice dropped lower. That's why you need the dates. When she hung up, I did not move for a long moment. The house around me held itself in that strained ordinary stillness only old houses can manage. A radiator clicked in the dining room. A car went by outside with snow-muffled tires, though there was no fresh snow on the ground, only that cold, damp February grit the suburbs live in after a thaw. The refrigerator motor stopped. Somewhere upstairs, the settling wood made one small complaint and then thought better of it. I looked down at the card again, thinking of you all and of Sunday night. I hope the chicken casserole sat well with Caleb. I turned slowly toward the cookbook lying open on the table. Helen's note sat there in pencil plain as a ledger entry and twice as cruel. First made this after Nora's service. Caleb ate 2 helpings. February 11th. A Sunday night casserole. A Monday postmark. A penciled date 2 days later than the card in my hand. And 1 week later than the burial that had already become fixed in family memory like law. I sat back down at the table and spread the card beside the cookbook page so I could see them together. Then I understood the thing that chilled me enough to make the room seem briefly airless. Neither date was the problem by itself. The problem was that both were written by women who did not confuse dates, and together they placed a family supper after the day we had always carried as the end of Nora Bell's story. I do not mean merely after her funeral. I mean after the point at which grief in our house had always been taught to settle. I sat there long after the kitchen had gone dim enough to require the under-cabinet lights with Mara's card on one side of Helen's cookbook and the photograph on the other, trying to force the 3 things into a single honest arrangement. They would not go. That was the first new feeling in the house. Not fear exactly. Resistance. As if the rooms had been built for ordinary grief and were now being asked to hold something more exacting than sorrow. The card said, Sunday night. The cookbook said February 11th. The photograph said Nora standing alive beside my son after I had already stood in a cemetery and watched clods of wet winter dirt hit a coffin. I reached for the cookbook again, but not the way I had earlier. Not as a man seeking comfort. More like a man laying hands on a witness who had already disappointed him by being right too late. Helen's blue mechanical pencil slid loose from the spiral and rolled toward the edge of the table. I caught it with 2 fingers before it fell. The eraser was worn nearly flat. There was a bite mark on the barrel near the silver clip from years ago, back when she corrected quizzes at the kitchen table and chewed on pencils in a way she always denied. I turned it over once in my hand, then laid it across the open page as if that might keep the room from moving under me. I went through the rest of the bundle in the bread tin. The older sympathy cards had the stale, papery smell things get when they've been kept in a kitchen too long, without being often touched a mixture of dust, old glue, and whatever sweetness had once lived nearby. A ribbon of sesame crumbs from the crackers had fallen inside one envelope and left a faint, oily mark. Helen had tucked 2 recipe clippings among the cards, probably for safekeeping, and then forgotten them. One was for a ham glaze she never used because she said cherries had no business near pork unless the cook had given up. The other was a local newspaper clipping for winter squash soup, and across its margin she had written in pencil too thin now to catch at first glance, Nora hates nutmeg. Elise doesn't. I felt the skin along my arms tighten. I read it twice to make sure I had not invented the second half. The handwriting was Helen's, the thin slanted print she used when she was noting something for herself and had no expectation anyone else would ever read it. Nora hates nutmeg. Elise doesn't. I set the clipping down carefully beside the cookbook. For a few seconds I did not think. I listened. House sounds. The baseboard heat in the dining room clicking into another cycle. The small groan from the pipe near the mudroom when hot water moved through it. The refrigerator motor beginning again. They all seemed to arrive with unreasonable clarity, as if the house had decided that if I was finally going to pay attention, it would not waste the opportunity by speaking softly. Elise. Until that moment, I had been forcing my mind to keep her at the edges where she had lived for years, in our family-adjacent, useful, vaguely irritating in ways a widower and a father could both scold himself for noticing. She had come into our orbit after the accident as one of the people from the Community Arts Center where Caleb volunteered during college breaks. Later, she became one of those women who seem to travel with tragedies, not because they cause them, but because they are good at making sorrow look socially manageable. She brought food, remembered dates, helped with arrangements, knew how to fold a sympathy napkin and where to place flowers so the room looked balanced but not festive. If grief had a junior clergy in the suburbs, Elise had served on it for years. Helen had once called her helpful in a way that makes me want to count spoons afterward, and I had laughed because I assumed my wife was just tired of being out-organized in her own kitchen. Now the line about nutmeg sat in front of me like a bruise I had not seen forming. Nora hates nutmeg. Elise doesn't. The distinction should have been ridiculous. It would have been ridiculous in any ordinary house, any ordinary family. But our house had already left ordinary behind and had not bothered to inform me formally. I picked up the newspaper clipping and held it nearer the light. The note was unquestionably Helen's. The paper itself had yellowed at the edges. I could not remember exactly when she had clipped that soup recipe, only that it must have been during the years when she still cooked too ambitiously for winter suppers and then complained about the leftovers for 3 days. There had been a night suddenly I could see it cleanly when Nora sat at our table in her 2nd year with Caleb and took one bite of squash soup, then smiled apologetically at Helen and asked whether the nutmeg could be left out next time because it made everything taste like somebody spilled Christmas in it. Helen had laughed so hard she had to set her spoon down. Caleb had rolled his eyes and said Nora insulted perfectly good ingredients as a hobby. It was one of those tiny disposable family moments that become dear only because no one knew it needed saving. I had forgotten it entirely. Helen had not. I put the clipping flat on the table and felt under the first surge of alarm, something worse, shame. Not because I had forgotten a woman's seasoning preference from 9 years ago. No sane man should condemn himself for that. But because the note proved Helen had been tracking distinctions inside the house with a seriousness I had mistaken for fussiness. Not grieving, not reminiscing, tracking. I gathered the cards and clippings and cookbook into a single stack, then stopped myself. No. Sequence mattered now. I laid them back out. Cookbook open. Mara's card at the right. Photograph above. Nutmeg clipping below. Helen's blue pencil across the margin like a ruler. By then the casserole ingredients on the counter had gone accusatory. Chicken growing cold under wax paper. Celery half chopped. Rice still measured. The mound of paprika softening in the dampness of the room. Helen would have hated waste more than interruption, so I wrapped the chicken, put the celery in a glass bowl, tipped the rice back into its jar, and wiped the counter clean. I did it in her order and with none of her piece. Afterward, I stood at the sink and looked into the black window over the yard. There are certain reflections that make a man understand how alone a house can become, even while still full of objects. My own face hovered over the dark side yard, older than I usually see it, because that was Helen's angle, not mine. She always stood at the sink, a fraction turned left hip against the cabinet, looking outward, while her hands finished the last task in the room. During the last winter of her illness, she stood there one night after the dishes and said, "If I die before you, don't turn this house into a museum." Houses get dishonest when people are too polite to use them. I'm not polite enough for that, I told her. You are exactly polite enough for that. At the time, I kissed the back of her neck and said nothing because I believed she was talking about sentimentality, about the common widow and widower mistake of preserving rooms too carefully. I did not think she might be warning me about a different kind of dishonesty altogether. I slept badly, though sleep is not the right word for what happened between midnight and dawn. I lay in our bed upstairs listening to the house settle around me and watching every contradiction from the kitchen reform itself behind my eyes. The photograph, the card, the note about nutmeg. Once near 3, I got up and walked the upstairs hall with no purpose except motion. The guest room door stood open. Helen's old dressing robe still hung from the back of it because I had not decided whether removing it would honor reality or betray something gentler. Her side of our closet held only empty wooden hangers and 2 winter coats I had not given away yet. The house at that hour did not feel haunted. It felt annotated. By morning, I had done what I always do when I cannot make sense of a thing. I turned it into work. I made coffee too dark because I let the grounds run long. I buttered toast I did not eat. Then I carried the photograph and the clipped notes and Mara's card into the den and sat in Helen's old wingback by the lamp with a legal pad on my knee. History teacher, husband, father. None of those roles had prepared me for the task in front of me, so I used the only discipline I trusted: chronology. Known dates. February 3rd burial. February 9th Sunday supper, referenced by Mara. February 10th, postmark. February 11th, recipe notation. Unknown date of photograph. Unknown date of clipping. Unknown reason. Helen had paired a soup recipe note about nutmeg with Elise's name. I wrote each line down. Then I looked up at the memorial shelf. Daylight in the den made the room less solemn and more arranged. The shelves to either side of the fireplace held the same books they had held for 15 years. My American history volumes, Helen's mysteries, photo albums along the lower built-ins, 3 pottery bowls nobody used, and the memorial things gathered into a polite middle band where the eye could settle without being asked too much. I stood and went to the shelf where Nora's silver frame sat. I picked it up and looked behind it. Nothing there. Then I lifted the other framed photographs one by one more, because I no longer believed in leaving any object untested than because I expected a revelation. Under Helen's wedding photo frame there was a square of darker wood where the sun had not reached. Under the ceramic, cardinal dust. Under Nora's frame, another photograph. For a second I thought I had found the answer too quickly and therefore had probably found the wrong one. It was face down, the glossy back visible under the frame's edge. I slid it out. Same size as the one from the cookbook. Same wash of drugstore gloss. This time the image was of Caleb alone, standing on our back porch, in his old charcoal coat, one hand on the rail head, half turned as if someone had just called his name. The angle suggested the photo had been taken from the yard. The porch light was on above him, throwing down that yellow halo it always had, before I replaced the fixture after Helen died. Snow lay in grey ridges along the edge of the patio stones. There was no date on the back, but there did not need to be. It was our house, our porch, our old light. I felt the first true turn of the morning then, not because a photo of Caleb on our porch was sinister by itself, but because it belonged to a sequence. If the porch shot and the photograph of Caleb with Nora were taken the same night, then Nora had not only been alive later than she should have been, she had been at my house later than she should have been. I checked the den shelf again with a care that bordered on piety and found nothing else hidden behind the frames. But the room had changed under me. Yesterday it had been a place where grief had been politely gathered. This morning it looked like a place where grief had been edited. The albums were on the lower built-in. I crouched and pulled out the one labeled 2006 to 2008 in Helen's handwriting. The cover was navy cloth, worn paler at the edges from use. I carried it to the desk under the front window and began turning pages. Christmases, garden center trip, Caleb's freshman dorm move-in with Nora grinning behind a stack of towels. Nora on our back steps holding a mug of coffee and making a face because Helen had caught her before makeup, which she insisted mattered less than it plainly did. Summer cookout, Thanksgiving place settings. Then the pages thinned toward the accident year and the photographs grew fewer, as if the family had developed an instinct for not preserving too much just before it needed to. Near the back of the album was a page with black photo corners and no photographs in them, only the faint square shadows where pictures had once sat. Under one square, Helen had written in pencil, then partly erased porch. Under another red coat, the erasure had been done hard enough to roughen the paper. I sat back slowly in the desk chair. The album was not missing random photographs. It had once contained those photographs. Maybe the exact 2 I had found. Maybe more from the same sequence. Helen had removed them later, or someone else had. I heard the front door latch move and almost dropped the album. For a brief, absurd second, I thought of burglars, though no sensible burglar announces himself with the ordinary front door at 10 in the morning. Then Caleb said, Dad and I understood the sharper truth. I had not expected him to come because I no longer trusted him to come toward difficulty. I'm in here, I called. He appeared in the den doorway, carrying the outside cold with him. Dark wool coat, open scarf, loose hair flattened on one side from the drive. He looked more tired than he had sounded on the phone. That stirred something paternal in me, which embarrassingly made the next thing I felt angrier, not softer. He saw the album in my lap and the photographs on the desk and stopped. You've been at this all morning. I didn't sleep much. He stepped into the room, but not all the way, hovering in that place by the threshold where he had stood in one form or another since he was 16 whenever he wanted to keep one foot in retreat. Let me see the picture. I handed him the one from the cookbook first. He held it by the edges and looked at it a long time. No performance, no sudden story to make it harmless. His face did something I had not seen in years. It emptied itself of adult management and showed me for one flicker the young man beneath. Where exactly was this, he asked. In your mother's cookbook. He nodded once, still staring at the image. And the other, I gave him the porch photograph. He looked at that too, and when he saw the porch light behind himself, his jaw tightened. You know this night, I said. He did not answer. Caleb. I know pieces of nights from then. That is a sentence designed to survive scrutiny, not help your father. He let out a short breath that might have been a laugh in a kinder house. You always did know how to turn disappointment into grammar. I taught teenagers for 38 years. It's a transferable skill. He looked back at the photograph. I'm not trying to be difficult. No. He lowered the picture. I'm trying to tell you that after the accident, there are days I remember like still frames and others. I remember because people told me enough times what happened, that the telling took the place of the thing. The sentence was honest enough that I could not despise it, though I wanted to. He set the photos on the desk and looked at the album page with the empty corners. Did Mom do this? I don't know. Looks like her pencil. It is her pencil. He was quiet. Was Elise at this house the night these were taken? I asked. At the sound of her name, his eyes shifted to me quickly, then away. There was a period, he said, when a lot of people were around. That is not an answer. No. I got up from the desk and stood near the window, partly because I needed the distance and partly because my own son had a way of making me feel interrogative and helpless at the same time, which I had never quite learned how to bear gracefully. When did Elise first come here? I asked. He rubbed his left wrist with his right thumb, a habit he has had since the fracture from the crash healed crooked. I had not seen him do it in years. Sooner than you think. How much sooner, I don't know. Try. He looked tired enough to sit down, but proud enough not to. She helped after, with meals, with some things for Nora's aunt. There were people in and out. You and Mom were dealing with me, and with the bells, and with the church, and all the rest of it. Helen would have remembered. Yes, he said softly. She would. The way he said it touched the bruise inside me instead of soothing it. Did your mother distrust her? I asked. No, it came too fast. I turned. That sounded practiced. He looked at the floor. Mom had opinions about everybody. That is not the same thing. He stayed silent. The front bell rang then sharp enough to break the room in two. Caleb flinched at it. I nearly laughed, not because anything was funny, but because my house was beginning to time its interruptions with indecent skill. When I opened the door, Elise stood on the stoop with a casserole dish wrapped in one of those quilted carriers women carry when they intend to look temporary and indispensable at once. She had on a camel coat, gloves, and a scarf knotted with easy competence under her chin. Her hair was pinned back in the neat way that always made her look as if she had dressed for being trusted. If she was surprised to see Caleb's car in the drive, she did not show it. I was in the neighborhood, she said. I made chicken tetrazzini and then remembered neither of you will cook unless cornered. I did not move aside immediately, and in that small pause I saw something alert in her face before she put kindness back over it. That's generous, I said. I know Caleb's project deadline is this week. Her eyes went past me into the hall. And Sundays can feel long. It struck me then that she was speaking to a version of my house she had no business knowing this intimately. Caleb had come to the front hall behind me. Elise. She smiled at him with exactly the right amount of concern and no ownership on the surface. You look tired. So do you, he said, which in another family might have been affectionate and in ours sounded like two people confirming they both knew something unnamed. I took the casserole carrier from her. You didn't have to do this. Of course I did. Then, because she was too socially fluent to ignore tension without making it obvious, she added lightly, "Should I be worried? I've interrupted a tribunal." Nobody answered. She stepped past me into the hall anyway. A good house tells on people by how they enter it. Some step in and wait for permission from the rooms. Some cross a threshold as if thresholds are only suggestions. Elise paused just enough to wipe her boots on the mat, then turned toward the kitchen with the ease of someone who already knew where the light switches were. Watching her move through the center hall, I had the strange, ugly sensation of seeing a person walk through someone else's memory wearing the right coat. The kitchen still held the morning's evidence spread half neatly on the table. I saw her see the cards before she saw the cookbook, and I saw the tiny correction in her face before it vanished. Nothing dramatic. Just a microsecond of recalculation so small most people would have called me obsessive for noticing it. I didn't realize I was walking into a family archive, she said. Neither did I. I replied. She set her gloves on the counter and looked at the cookbook. Helen's old church book. Do you remember it? She smiled. Everybody remembers Helen's cookbook. She used to prop it open with the sugar bowl because the binding was always giving out. Helen had never done that. She used the blue crockery spoon rest for that purpose because she said sugar had enough burdens. The correction rose to my mouth and stopped there. It was too small alone, too easy to dismiss, yet the wrongness of it moved through me in the same direction as the note about nutmeg. Caleb leaned against the refrigerator, arms folded. "What are you doing here, Elise? Bringing lunch apparently into hostile territory." Her tone stayed soft. "Mara called me this morning." That brought the room to stillness. I said, "Why would Mara call you?" She sounded upset. She said Tom found some old things, and she was afraid everyone was going to start hurting themselves with half memories. Elise looked at me then, and there it was again, that calm, corrective voice I had always disliked without fully earning the dislike. I thought I might help. Help with what I asked, with context. It was the exact wrong word. I moved to the table and laid a hand on the open cookbook. "Did you know my wife hid photographs in here?" She looked at the picture from the cookbook. Nothing in her face moved. I didn't know she hid anything. Helen wasn't theatrical. That was true, almost offensively true, which made the sentence feel chosen. "Do you know when this was taken?" I asked. She came nearer enough to see the picture clearly, but not enough to touch it. "I'm not sure," Caleb said. "Don't." She turned to him. "I'm not doing anything. You're always doing something." The bitterness in his voice startled all three of us. I saw it startle him too. Elise let out a slow breath. "All right, then let's not make this harder," I said. "You mentioned context." She glanced down at the cookbook again, and for the first time I saw her weigh whether to answer at all. There were some evenings after the accident, she said carefully, when people came and went. Food got dropped off, photos got taken. Nobody was sleeping. Nora's aunt was overwhelmed. Your mother was trying to keep Caleb upright. Those days bled together. The explanation was neat enough to survive on the surface. It was also, to my surprise, not enough anymore. I opened the cookbook to the clipped soup recipe and slid it toward her. "Then explain this." Her eyes moved to the margin note. "Nora hates nutmeg. Elise doesn't." Something changed in her mouth. Only once. Then it was gone. "I don't know what that means," she said. "Don't you know?" Her tone remained maddeningly even. "Helen wrote all sorts of things." I heard myself laugh once quietly. "No, she didn't." That must have sounded stranger than I intended because both Caleb and Elise looked at me in the same instant. "She wrote exact things I said. That was the whole point." For a moment, no one spoke. The refrigerator hummed behind Caleb. A truck shifted gears somewhere on the street. Light from the sink window caught the casserole carrier and made the aluminum edges flash. Elise recovered first, as people like her usually do. "Tom," she said. and lowered her voice as if we were now sharing reason against excess. I think you're tired and upset, and I think you're putting too much weight on loose paper in a kitchen. That was the sentence that made me understand how dangerous she was in a way I had not before. Not because it was cruel, because it was almost kind. It was the sort of sentence that gives a man one more chance to embarrass himself into silence. I looked at her, and saw not for the first time, but for the first time clearly, a person who survived by making the more exact observer feel rude. Caleb pushed off the refrigerator. I'm going outside. Stay, I said. He paused, hand half raised toward the mudroom door. Dad. Stay. He looked at Elise, then at me, and for once chose not to leave. I said to her, When did you first come into this house after Nora died? I don't know. You seem to know where my wife propped her cookbook and what Sundays feel like here. That isn't the same thing. No, I said, it isn't. Her expression cooled by half a degree. I was around sooner than you might remember. There it was. How much sooner, I asked. She folded her gloves once neatly. Within a week, I suppose. Caleb said without looking at either of us. 3 days. I turned to him so sharply my chair legs scraped the floor. What? He stared at the mudroom door. She was here 3 days after. The room tightened around that sentence. Elise said, still soft, Caleb, no. The single syllable had more exhaustion in it than anger. I looked at my son. Why would she be here 3 days after? He swallowed. Because there were people everywhere, and because Nora's aunt didn't want certain things left at her place, and because Mom said food had to get sorted, and because nobody was sleeping, and because you were driving to Columbus twice a day, and I don't know, Dad. Because it happened. He was breathing too fast by the end of it. The old instinct rose in me to make it stop, to smooth the room for his sake. That instinct had governed too much of my life with him after the accident. I felt it rise now, and for the first time in years refused it. Certain things, I said. His jaw hardened. Belongings. Whose belongings? He closed his eyes for a moment. Nora's. I looked from him to Elise. She said, there was confusion. Her aunt was in no state to manage anything. Then why not say that years ago, I asked. Because nobody asked it like this years ago. That landed worse than the others because there was some truth in it. Nobody had asked. We had mourned. We had fed people. We had survived. Helen had perhaps kept notes. I had mistaken survival for comprehension. Did Nora's belongings come into this house? I asked. Elise hesitated. Caleb answered instead. Some of them, I felt. Then the old false belief began to crack. Not collapse yet, but split enough to let cold through. I had believed the house held grief about Nora. That was all. Photographs, a frame, a memory shelf, a casserole note. The ordinary remains of a loss, a family absorbed and then carried. I had not believed the house might have held Nora herself in pieces, coat preferences, objects the raw material of a dead woman's continuation. I said, where Caleb rubbed his wrist again. I don't know. Try harder. Dad. Where the guest room for a while, he said. Some boxes, maybe the hall cabinet. Mom was trying to sort things for her aunt. I closed my eyes once. When I opened them, the kitchen no longer felt like the safest room in the house. It felt like the only honest one. Elise. I said thank you for the casserole. She understood dismissal immediately. That alone told me how often she had managed rooms like this. She picked up her gloves. I think you're all exhausted. Yes, I said. We are. At the front door she paused and turned back. Her face had softened again into concern, but something in it no longer worked on me. Tom, grief makes time strange. Not to Helen, I said. For the first time she had no immediate answer. After she left, Caleb stood in the kitchen staring at the closed front door as if part of him had gone out with her and part of him was grateful. You should have told me, I said. He looked at me then, and he looked younger than 38. Not boyish, damaged in the old place, About which part? Any of it. He laughed once without humor. You make it sound like there was a clean version. I rested both hands on the table on either side of the open cookbook. I am trying very hard not to hear that as an excuse. Maybe stop trying so hard to hear everything as a moral failing. The words hit where they were aimed because they were mine as much as his. He had heard versions of them all his life from students, colleagues, his mother. I wanted to lash back, and instead I said quieter than before. Your mother wrote your life down in recipe margins because somebody in this house was paying attention. He went still. Neither of us had known until I said it that that was what I believed now. He looked at the cookbook, then at the clipping about nutmeg, then at the photographs. I didn't know she kept things like this. No, I said. Neither did I. He left an hour later after promising nothing except that he would answer his phone. That would have infuriated me once. Now it merely seemed like the offer of a man who did not trust himself not to retreat if he gave more. When the house closed behind him, I carried the album, the cookbook, the clipped note, and the photographs into the guest room. It was the room Helen's mother used when she visited, then the room where overflow from holidays and illnesses gathered after her mother died. Pale green walls, brass bed that squeaked if you sat too hard on the side. One narrow closet with bifold doors that never tracked properly. Helen's sewing basket on the top shelf because she liked keeping mending near a bed, as though socks and pillowcases should be healed where people were. The closet smelled faintly of cedar and old starch. I stood there a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. On the top shelf were boxed Christmas linens, 2 hat boxes, a stack of folded Afghans, and 3 banker's boxes with Helen's handwriting on the sides. Thanksgiving, church papers, miscellaneous guest room. I took down the last one. Inside were old bed skirts, a lampshade, 3 folded guest towels, and a grocery bag containing envelopes. On top of the envelopes sat a pair of women's gloves, not Helen's. Brown leather, lined worn at the fingertips. I knew them with the strange certainty of a memory re-entering through the body before the mind. Nora had worn gloves like that. Not because I had studied her hands at the time, but because one December she had left them on our radiator cover by the front door, and Helen had called after her halfway down the walk, saying, "Take your hands home with you." I sat down on the bed with the gloves in my lap and felt the room tilt. Why were they here? Why had they remained here all these years? Why had Helen kept them in a grocery bag among guest linens and old paper? There was no answer that did not cost me something. Under the gloves were the envelopes. Most were empty, their fronts marked in Helen's hand cards, copied duplicate prints. Belle. One still held photographs. I slid them out. Duplicate memorial prints. The graduation picture from the den shelf. A church bulletin insert with Nora's name and dates. Then one image that made my stomach go cold, all over again, the same porch photograph I had found behind the silver frame. But this copy had a penciled note on the back. Not for shelf, that was all. Helen's hand again. Firm. Final. I turned the photo face up and looked harder than before. Caleb on the porch, head turned, porch light above. Snow ridged by the steps. If Nora was present that night, she stood just outside the frame or had been in the previous image. The next one, perhaps, was the red coat photo from the cookbook. Sequence again. Helen had removed the porch photo from the album, hidden one copy behind the memorial shelf and stored another in a grocery bag, with gloves that likely belonged to Nora. Not for shelf. The bed squeaked when I stood up too fast. I carried the whole box down to the hall cabinet, outside the den, the one Caleb had mentioned almost without meaning to. It is a shallow, built-in with drawers below and shelves above intended for telephone books and writing paper in the 40s, then for batteries and light bulbs and social debris in every decade since. Helen kept the upper shelves neat. The lower drawer was a republic of postponed sorting. I opened it. Envelopes, photo sleeves from the drugstore, a packet of obituary clippings rubber-banded together, 2 Christmas letters, an old map of Columbus, A file folder marked funeral, not in Helen's hand, but in darker block print I recognized after a moment as Elise's. My fingers went cold on the folder tab. Inside were copied service programs, mailing lists, a florist receipt, and a typed sheet with names and addresses for thank you notes. At the bottom was a transfer receipt from the funeral home, the ink faded but legible enough. I did not understand it fully. Funeral paperwork is a language that dresses necessity and bureaucracy, but I understood enough to know it recorded the movement of a body from hospital custody to funeral care. The name listed was Nora Bell. The date, February 1st. Tucked behind it was another copy. Same layout, same date, but the typed line under the name an internal identifying number perhaps. Or a notation for personal effects did not match the first. I read both twice. The numbers were close but not identical. That alone might have meant nothing. Duplicate forms sometimes contain corrections. Clerks make errors. Old receipts misprint. I knew all that. But by then, my mind had been trained by Helen's notes to distrust discrepancies that asked too quickly to be forgiven. There was a sound behind me, then a shoe against the floorboard in the hall, and I turned so sharply the papers rustled from my hand. Mara stood there, coat still on, eyes wide from having frightened me. "I knocked," she whispered. "I didn't hear you." She looked from my face to the open cabinet drawer, to the papers in my hand, and came closer. Not all the way, only into the den threshold. Her voice dropped lower. "Did she come by?" Elise Mara nodded. "Yes." "How much did you show her?" Nothing she couldn't already guess. Mara closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and stepped nearer. She smelled of cold air and the peppermint lozenges she has lived on for 20 years. "Tom, listen to me." "I am listening." "No. Listen carefully." She glanced toward the front hall as if the house itself had ears she distrusted. "Do not leave anything out where she can see it. Not the photos, not the notes, not any of Helen's sorting." My mouth went dry. Why would I need to worry about that? She swallowed. Because once years ago I mentioned to Elise that one of the mailings had the wrong sequence on it. Just something small. I said the cards from the church supper looked like they had been printed in a hurry and maybe mixed with the memorial stack. She smiled at me and said grief makes us all desperate for order where there isn't any. And somehow, by the end of that conversation, I was apologizing to her. Mara's face under the hall light looked older than it had over the phone. Not weaker, more disgusted with herself. "She's good at that," I said. "Yes." Her whisper sharpened. "She's good at making exact people feel unkind." I held up the 2 transfer receipts. "Do these mean anything to you?" She came close enough to read them, but did not touch them. "I saw one of these once. Maybe not this exact copy." There was a packet on the sideboard after the service, while we were sorting acknowledgements. I remember because Helen was doing names at the table, and I said somebody had duplicated a page wrong. The numbers didn't match. And Helen took it from me. Mara's voice went even quieter. Not snatched, just took it and said she'd look later. My grip tightened on the papers. Did she ever mention it again? No. The house at that moment seemed to contract around the 2 of us, not dramatically, more like a person listening from the next room and deciding whether to enter. "Mara," I said, "what exactly are you afraid of?" Her eyes flicked toward the guest room stairs, then back to me. "I'm afraid that if Helen started noticing what I think she noticed, she was doing it alone. And I'm afraid you've been living in the tidy version of something because tidy was kinder." I almost laughed at the precision of that. Tidy was kinder. That had been my religion for years, and I had never named it. She reached into her tote and handed me an index card. On it, she had written a name and a number in blue ink. "Daniel Reeve," she said. "Retired funeral director. He handled overflow on county transfers for years. If anybody would know whether those numbers matter, it would be him." Why him? Because he was the one Helen mentioned once when she was upset about paperwork. Not upset enough to explain it to me, apparently. Just enough to ask whether Reeve was still working, because he's the sort who notices if things don't line up. I stared at the card in my hand. Helen asking after a funeral director. Helen noticing numbers. Helen removing photographs from albums and writing "not for shelf" on the backs of images taken at my own porch. The floor beneath the life I thought I had understood was not opening yet. It was worse than that. It was becoming legible. Mara touched my sleeve lightly. "Tom, what if Daniel tells you it's nothing? Believe him. Do you hear me? Don't make it bigger than the facts." I looked at her. "And if he tells me it's not nothing?" Her mouth tightened. "Then stop calling it grief." She left through the front hall, and I stood there with the index card and the receipts and felt the old belief inside me loosen another inch. Not broken, not gone, but no longer able to hold the whole weight of what the house had started giving back. I called Daniel Reeve that afternoon from the den desk because I wanted a surface under my elbows, and the den by then had become the room where facts required a chair. His voice on the phone was dry and level. The voice of a man who had spent decades speaking to the bereaved without granting emotion control of nouns. When I explained who I was and why I was calling, he did not rush to fill the silence afterward. That alone made me trust him more. "You have copies?" he asked. "Yes, bring them." "Would you rather I read the numbers?" "No." There was no rudeness in it. Only procedure. "Can I ask one question first?" I said. "You can. If two internal identifiers on funeral transfer documents don't match, what does that usually mean?" He was silent, long enough that I pictured him in a room lined with filing cabinets and old coats, considering how much decency a stranger could bear before the truth. "It usually means one of three things," he said at last. "A harmless, clerical duplication, a corrected form that should have replaced the earlier one, or a custody problem somebody hoped grief would keep from becoming a conversation." My hand flattened against Helen's album on the desk. "And which does this sound like?" "That," he said, "is why you bring me the copies." We set a time for the next morning. After the call, I sat a long while in the den without moving. The late winter light had shifted gold in the front windows. Street shadows from passing cars moved across the opposite wall and vanished. On the built-in shelf, Nora's silver frame stood where I had placed it back. And behind it now, I knew another photograph had once been hidden like a second truer pulse behind the official face. At 5:30, the house began its ordinary evening sounds. The boiler, the creak from the stair landing, the faint tick from the kitchen clock, but ordinary had become an exhausted disguise. The den felt wrong in a specific way now, not eerie. Edited. Every object in it seemed to have won its place by surviving elimination. I carried Helen's cookbook back to the kitchen and set it on the table. The signature object had changed entirely by then. 24 hours earlier, it had been the thing I reached for when grief needed instructions. Now it was something else, a ledger, a cross-examination, a record of my wife's mind still working after her voice had been taken away from me. I touched the stained page with the heel of my hand and thought of her at the kitchen counter saying, "Routine tells the truth slower." She had been right, and because she had been right, I had to face another possibility I had not wanted to name even to myself. Maybe the lie in this house was not only emotional, not only about memory and who remembered what when. Maybe paperwork had bent too. Maybe the burial itself had a seam in it. Maybe I had stood at a grave all those years ago believing the worst thing a family can believe, that whatever else happened, at least the dead had been named honestly, and maybe even that had been arranged into tidiness for our benefit. I opened the cookbook to the casserole page again and saw Helen's note in a way I had not when I first found it. "First made this after Nora's service. Caleb ate 2 helpings. February 11th. Not burial. Not funeral. Service." I sat down hard enough that the chair complained under me. Service. The distinction had always existed, but only now did it feel like a blade. We had used funeral and burial and service interchangeably all these years because families do that. Because sorrow blurs ceremony into event. But Helen had not written casually. She had written exactly. If she said service, she meant service. I stared at the pencil marks until they blurred, then sharpened again. A service could happen without a burial at the same time. A burial could happen later. Papers could move. Bodies could be transferred. Families could be told what to repeat until repetition became memory. My old false belief had been that confusion, if there was any, belonged to grief alone, that pain had softened dates-blurred rooms and made well-meaning people careless. Sitting there with Helen's exact word under my hand and Daniel Reeves' dry voice still in my ear, I felt that belief finally give way. This was not a family remembering badly. This was a sequence somebody had managed. I sat with that until the kitchen light changed from evening to night and the window over the sink turned me into a dark reflection standing inside Helen's room with another woman's confusion spread across the table. That was the shape of it by then. Not mystery, not yet. Confusion arranged by someone with steadier hands than mine. I slept for perhaps 2 hours in fragments and rose before dawn with the sort of clarity that comes only when fear has finally chosen a direction. I shaved badly, nicked myself under the chin, and stood in the bathroom staring at the bead of blood as though it belonged to a man less careful than I was. Then I went downstairs, made coffee, and brought everything to the kitchen table in 2 trips. The cookbook first, then the photo from between the casserole pages. The porch photograph, Mara's card, the clipped squash soup recipe with Helen's note about nutmeg. The service programs from the hall cabinet, the duplicate transfer forms, the old album with its empty corners and a yellow legal pad. I laid them out with the precision of a man trying not to come apart by forcing objects to behave. The kitchen had not looked this used in months, not alive. Used. The sugar bowl and salt cellar shoved aside. My reading glasses near the blue pencil, papers crossing the wood grain of the table in little dangerous drifts. Helen used to hate papers at the table. Paper breeds when it smells food, she would say, sweeping bills and school notices into piles before anyone sat down. Looking at my own spread of evidence there, I felt a fresh stab of pain that had nothing to do with Nora Bell or Elise Harrow or burial forms. I was doing the exact kind of work Helen would once have taken over from me with more discipline and less self-pity. Not because she distrusted my intelligence, because she trusted her own exactness more. That was the fresh humiliation of all this. Not that I had failed to love my wife properly. I had loved her as well as I knew how. It was that I had loved the parts of her that comforted me more readily than the parts that should have warned me. I took the legal pad and wrote one thing at the top in block letters. What is fixed? Under it. I wrote February 3rd burial, remembered by family. February 9th, Sunday supper referenced by Mara. February 10th postmark. February 11. Helen note after Nora's service. Transfer papers dated February 1st, numbers inconsistent. Photo sequence includes Nora at house after accepted burial timeline. Then below that, another heading. What was brought into this house? Nora belongings, photos, gloves, coat preferences, story. I stared at the last word a moment before underlining it twice. By 8:30, I had driven to Daniel Reeves' office on the west side of Columbus, a converted brick storefront tucked between a tax preparer and a dry cleaner that still used a neon sign from the 90s. Reeve had retired from the funeral business years earlier, but apparently retirement for men like him only meant they handled fewer people and more paper. The office smelled of toner, old carpet, and the medicinal peppermint some older men carry, as if their pockets are an annex of the pharmacy. He was thinner than I expected and more formal in a grey cardigan buttoned all the way up and a pressed shirt that suggested he still believed in the disciplines nobody was making him keep. His hair was white and close-cropped, and he wore glasses with the kind of frames that made him look like a principal from my boyhood. "Mr. Avery," he said, shaking my hand once, and not warmly, which I appreciated. Warmth from strangers in rooms like that can feel like advance pity. Tom is fine. Very well. Bring it here. He led me to a table under a standing lamp. No coffee offered, no small talk. Good. I set the copies down, then the photographs, because I did not know anymore what might matter to a man trained to read the dead through forms. He glanced at the photographs, only long enough to understand that they were not his starting point. Then he placed the two transfer copies side by side and used a letter opener to hold the corners flat. He read in silence for long enough that my body began to mistake stillness for threat. At last, he tapped one line with a blunt fingernail. These are not just duplicate copies with a typographical variation. I leaned forward. What are they? One is a transport intake record keyed to a provisional identification chain. The other is a finalized transfer authorization. He pushed his glasses up once. The numbering inconsistency means the chain changed. Meaning what? Meaning the body originally logged under one identifier did not travel cleanly into the final paperwork under the same internal chain. I looked at the lines and saw nothing but the bureaucracy of my own ignorance. In English, he folded his hands. In English, Mr. Avery. Something about the custody or identification process shifted before final disposition. That can happen for innocent reasons if an early intake was corrected, but if corrected properly, the first copy is usually voided or replaced cleanly, not left alongside the second. Would a family be told? Not unless the correction changed what the family was being asked to recognize or authorize. The room seemed to pull slightly away from me. So this is... what? A clerical problem. His gaze held on me, and there was no gentleness in it, only respect. It is enough of a problem that if I had seen these together in active practice, I would have required an explanation in writing. Did you... He paused. I did not see these together then. I saw a later packet with a note attached by someone else, and I recall the week because winter weather delayed half the county and every family believed their sorrow ought to move on time regardless of ice. He looked down again. The note in the file said identifiers reconciled. That phrase is often benign. It is also convenient. Can you tell me whether Nora Bell was buried on February 3rd? He sat back a fraction. I can tell you that paperwork associated with Nora Bell reached final processing around that date. I cannot tell you on these copies alone that the chain from hospital intake to burial was clean. I felt stupid asking the next question and asked it anyway. Could a memorial service happen before a burial? Of course. Would families use the words interchangeably later? Constantly. I thought of Helen's note. After Nora's service. Not burial, not funeral. Service. My throat tightened. Reeve saw it happen and said not unkindly, exact wording matters most when only one person in the room was paying attention. The sentence struck me with such force that for a second I could not speak. Helen again. Helen writing service because she meant service and trusting perhaps, against all available evidence, that someday I would finally understand the difference between language that soothed and language that held. I put a hand flat on the table to steady myself. What do I do with this? That depends on whether you are asking a legal question or a moral one. Today, yes. Moral. He nodded once. Then you determine whether the people who taught your family what happened were speaking from confusion or from control. I looked at the photographs then. Nora in the red coat, Caleb on the porch. Images taken on a night that had no place in our official mourning. And if it was control, then don't confront anyone until your timeline can survive being called grief. He gathered the papers back into a clean stack and handed them to me. Bring me anything else with dates. On the drive home, I kept both hands at 10 and 2 like an elderly man on a licensing exam. It had rained overnight, and the roads held that winter sheen of drying salt and shallow puddles in patched asphalt. Every red light seemed a deliberate insult. My mind kept circling one phrase from Reeve, speaking from confusion or from control. At home, I did not put my coat away. I went straight to the kitchen table and added a third heading to the legal pad. Who taught us what happened? Nora's aunt, Vivian Bell. Caleb, Helen, me, Church, Elise. Then I crossed out Caleb and rewrote it lower on the page. Who taught Caleb what happened? The distinction mattered more. I called Mara and asked her to come over. I did not tell her why on the phone because I had begun to understand the danger of letting half-shaped facts travel through air before they had weight enough to resist correction. She arrived 40 minutes later, carrying her canvas tote and a face prepared for bad weather. I sat her at the kitchen table with the cookbook open to Helen's note and Reeve's explanation as close to word for word as I could manage it. Mara listened without interrupting. Twice she glanced toward the den doorway. Each time she did, I felt the truth of that room shift another degree. The memorial shelf had become a wall of approved sequence. The den was no longer where grief lived. It was where grief had been posed. When I finished, Mara drew off one glove finger by finger and laid both gloves in her lap. I need you to tell me exactly what you stayed quiet about, I said. Her mouth tightened. More than one thing. Then start anywhere. She looked down at Helen's note. The first thing was after the service. I was at your house helping stack dishes because your church women will feed people through an apocalypse but cannot be trusted to rinse anything properly. I was in the dining room with the tray table and some of the sympathy envelopes. Helen was at the kitchen table doing names. Elise came in from the guest room with 2 boxes and said Vivian wanted certain personal things kept separate until she could collect them. Personal things belonging to Nora. Mara nodded. That was how it was framed. And Mara swallowed. And I remember thinking it was odd that Elise was the one carrying them and not family. But odd is not illegal, Tom. Not in a grieving house. Then later, when we were sorting acknowledgements, I saw one of those transfer pages and the church mailing list on the same sideboard. I noticed the sequence looked wrong. One of the condolence packets from the youth choir had been stamped for after the burial date, but seemed to refer to a supper before. I said something careless about clerks getting ahead of themselves. She looked up at me. Helen took the papers from me. Elise was in the doorway, not smiling, not frowning, just listening. Did Helen say anything then? Only that she'd handle it. I looked at the cookbook, then at Mara. Did she? Mara gave a tired little shake of the head. Not to me. But a week or so later, she asked whether I remembered if Vivian Bell had family in Chillicothe, or just Columbus. I told her I didn't know why. She said she was trying to sort who had taken what after the service. Taken what? She didn't say. I wrote Vivian Bell on the pad, then Chillicothe, then underlined, taken what? What else, I asked. Mara rubbed her thumbnail along the edge of her index card, the old habit returning. The second thing is uglier, because it sounds trivial until you place it in a kitchen. That first winter after Nora died, your remembrance supper changed. I looked up. It was subtle, she said quickly. The kind of thing only women who help in other people's kitchens notice. Helen always made that chicken and rice casserole after funerals because it sat well and reheated kindly. But later, when Elise started helping more often, there were preferences attached. People saying Nora liked cinnamon in the apples. Nora liked nutmeg in squash. Nora liked the cranberry relish with orange peel. She didn't, I said. No. Mara's voice was quiet. She didn't. But each time someone said otherwise, Helen would go still for half a second. Then she would either say nothing or note it somewhere. I thought it was normal tension. Another woman getting too comfortable in a bereaved mother's kitchen, or in your case, a bereaved house. That happens. I did not understand then that somebody might be teaching your family a dead woman's tastes by replacement. Replacement. The word slid through the room and left nothing where it touched unchanged. Who was saying those things, I asked. Mara did not answer quickly enough. Elise. She nodded. I sat back and let the pain of that settle where it wanted. Not sexual betrayal. Not some cheap late twist about a hidden affair or a secret marriage. Worse in its own way because it entered through usefulness, through care, through the domestic places people grant to the grieving and the gracious. A woman had entered my house carrying another woman's preferences as if the dead could be gently edited by whoever stood closest to the stove. Helen had seen it. Of course she had. I thought suddenly of a memory I had carried for years as evidence of Helen's pettiness and now understood as evidence of my own stupidity. It was 2 winters after Nora's death. We had hosted Caleb for one of the few Sunday suppers he still reliably attended then. Helen made apple crisp. Elise came too because by then that no longer seemed unusual. Halfway through dessert, Elise had laughed and said, "Nora always said your apples needed more cinnamon, Helen." The room had gone quiet in a way I found embarrassing. Helen smiled, not coldly, not warmly, and said, "Then it's lucky she isn't cooking them." Later that night in bed, I told Helen she had been a little sharp. She turned off her lamp and said into the dark, "There are some imprecisions I don't intend to help." I had taken it for jealousy, territorial, female nonsense. The sort of thing decent men are trained to dismiss because acknowledging it requires more curiosity than superiority. Now, sitting at the table with Mara, I felt that old memory shift so hard it might as well have been a crack in plaster. "She was trying to stop it," I said. Mara looked at me. "Yes. Not softly, not mercifully." "Yes." I nodded once and looked down because there are some griefs a man can only endure by giving his eyes another task. "Mara," I said after a long moment, "did Caleb know?" "That depends what you mean by know." "I mean, did he understand that Elise was supplying Nora to him in pieces?" Her face worked with pity and stopped before it reached full expression. "I think Caleb understood what he could live with." That answer would have sounded evasive in another room. In mine, it sounded precise. When Mara left, the house had changed again, not in imagination, in logic. The kitchen was still honest because Helen had left her mind in it, but the rest of the first floor now felt partitioned by motive. The den held arranged memory. The guest room closet held withheld matter. The hall cabinet held paper that wanted to become sequence. Even the dining room sideboard, where Mara had once seen transfer forms beside church mailing lists, now looked when I passed it like a stage flat from a play about respectable mourning. By noon, I had made my first deliberate, strategic move. I called Caleb and asked him to come over that evening. I did not tell him what I had learned. I told him only that I wanted to go through one meal with him in order. "Not your life," I said when he asked what that meant. "One supper. That sounds insane." "Then it should feel familiar." He was quiet long enough that I knew he was deciding whether refusing would make him appear more guilty than frightened. At last he said, "Fine." Then I called Elise and left a message I knew she would hear the way I intended it. "I found more of Helen's notes," I said. "You may want to be here tonight if there's context I'm missing." It was bait, and I knew it. I also knew Helen would have approved if she'd believed the target deserved no better. The rest of the afternoon I spent in the basement where the house delivered its most memorable cruelty. Our basement is unfinished, except for one paneled room at the back that Caleb used for trains when he was a boy, and I used later for grading papers when the house got loud. The main open space holds shelves, the old chest freezer, paint cans, Storm's windows, and the ordinary archaeology of a middle-aged family that once believed square footage meant future control. Helen stored remembrance leftovers in the chest freezer with masking tape labels on the lids because she refused to waste food attached to grief. "People cook to be useful when they can't be useful any other way," she used to say. "The least we can do is eat it twice." I had not opened that freezer in months. The lid gave a small rubber sigh when I lifted it. Cold air breathed up around my face, carrying that faint metallic smell of ice and old paper labels. Inside were plastic containers stacked with more order than I deserved. Chicken stock meatballs, 2 loaves of banana bread from after Helen's funeral, and along the right side a run of flatter containers labeled in Helen's hand with years and occasion. Nora Supper, 2017. Nora Supper, 2018. Lent Soup, 2019. Post-funeral ham, 2025. I stood there under the basement pull chain light and felt my pulse begin again. The labels after 2017 changed. At first I thought the difference was only because her illness had made her writing less steady. Then I saw it more clearly. The 2017 container was Helen's hand. The 2018 and 2019 were not. Similar enough in slant to pass a quick look. Wrong in pressure and spacing. The capital N in Nora was tighter, the S in supper overshaped. Somebody had copied Helen's labeling habit and not quite reached the bones of it. I took out the 2017 and 2018 containers and set them on the work table under the hanging bulb. Not just the writing, the tape itself differed. Helen used blue painter's tape because it peeled clean. The later labels were on white freezer tape. That alone meant little. Stores run out, habits bend. Except that Helen's blue tape dispenser still sat on the shelf beside the old refrigerator half full. I looked back into the freezer and saw another thing. The 2018 lid had a second strip of tape beneath the first faintly visible where old adhesive shadowed the plastic. Relabeled. I carried both containers upstairs, set them on the kitchen counter, and called Mara back. When she arrived and saw what I'd found, she put a hand over her mouth. She changed the labels, I said. Mara came closer but did not touch them, or recopied them. Why? Her answer came almost immediately, to make the meal feel continuous. That was the terror of it. Not because it was flamboyant, because it was domestic. A woman had entered my house deeply enough to relabel the remains of our grief so that one year's supper flowed into the next without visible fracture. She had not needed to forge a will or steal a key or drug a drink. She had needed only access to tape handwriting and a family too tired to ask who was naming the containers. For one ugly instant, the kitchen itself felt hostile, not cursed, not monstrous, not any of the adolescent words people use when they want a house to carry their fear for them. Hostile, because every surface in it now seemed to ask me how many years I had mistaken order for innocence. That evening, I left the relabeled containers on the side counter where anyone entering could see them. Beside them, I placed the blue tape dispenser Helen had always used. Beside that, the cookbook open to the casserole page. When Caleb arrived, he stopped in the kitchen doorway, exactly as I knew he would. "What is this dinner?" I said, though there was no food yet. He looked more wary than tired now. "You called Elise, didn't you?" "Yes." He let out a breath through his nose. "Why would you do that?" "Because if she's been helping you remember, she can help me too." "That isn't funny." "No." He came in farther, eyes moving over the containers, the tape dispenser, the legal pad, the photographs. His shoulders tightened. "This is too much." I said, "Your mother used blue tape." He stared at me, not understanding, then looked at the counter and did. His face changed. "That doesn't mean—" "No," I said. "Not by itself." The bell rang then. Elise entered, carrying no food this time, only gloves, and her calm. She had changed into a darker coat, charcoal this time, which on another woman might have looked flattering, and on her looked strategic. She saw the setup on the counter, and to her credit or danger did not let herself stop moving. She took off her gloves, one finger at a time, and laid them on the edge of the table as though we were about to discuss school zoning. "You said Helen left notes," she said. "She did." I gestured toward a chair. She remained standing. "Good," I thought. "Let your balance feel this room." Caleb moved to the far side of the kitchen, nearer the mudroom door than the table. It was a position of retreat, and for once I was glad to see it. Retreat meant he had stopped believing he could manage this by composure alone. I started with the smallest thing and watched her. Nora hated nutmeg. Elise's expression did not move. If Helen wrote that, then she probably did. She did write it. All right. And you don't. A tiny pause. Do I not? It was an excellent line. Light, almost amused. Designed to make the speaker look irrational for building weight atop seasoning. I hated how expertly she used scale. I said, Helen wrote both. Then Helen was keeping score in a way I didn't understand. She tilted her head slightly. Tom, what are you asking me? I moved the 2017 and 2018 containers closer together. Why these labels are in different hands? She looked down. I couldn't say. You relabeled the 2018 one? No. Helen used blue tape. That year she may not have had it. I lifted the dispenser from beside the containers and set it between us. The small clack of plastic on wood was louder than it should have been. Elise looked at it, then at me. Something in her eyes cooled. Caleb said from behind me, Stop. I turned. Stop? What? This. He gestured helplessly at the counter at the whole room. This courtroom kitchen thing. I took a breath and made myself lower my voice. Then, help me keep it from becoming one. Tell me why Elise was here 3 days after Nora's death carrying her belongings into the guest room. He shut his eyes once. When he opened them, he looked not angry but cornered. I don't know every reason. You know some. Her Aunt Vivian asked for help. There were boxes. Mom said she'd sort things until the Bell family had room. Sort what clothes, photos, personal things. I said, and who decided Elise should be part of that? No answer. Elise. She met my eyes. Vivian trusted me. Why we'd known each other through the center and through Nora. Through Nora. The phrase hung there, offering connection while hiding structure. I said, How well did you know Nora? Well enough? No, I said. That answer belongs in a committee meeting. How well? She folded one glove over the other. Well enough that when things became difficult, I was asked to help. Again, useful, again impossible to challenge cleanly without looking cruel to a helpful woman in a kitchen. I was starting to understand the full architecture of her power. It did not depend on lies bold enough to disprove at once. It depended on making every exact question sound disproportionate to the decency of the moment. It was a control system built from manners. I shifted tactics. Do you remember the winter storm the week after the service? I asked. Caleb looked at me as though I had become unwell. Elise said, Not exactly. I do, I said, because Helen wrote about it. I turned the cookbook toward them and tapped another note I had found that afternoon near a page for stewed apples. Couldn't get Macintosh after Thor. Used galas instead. Rained all week. Then I slid the photograph of Nora in the red coat beside it. This picture, I said, was taken the week it rained, not the week it snowed. Caleb stared. How do you know Porch shot first? I said, laying that one down beside it. Snow on the rail, then rain later. The red coat photo shows wet shine on the step edge and no snowpack at the door. Your mother notes the apple shortage after the thaw. Mara's card puts Sunday supper on the 9th. The service may have happened earlier, but this I touched the photograph belongs to the rain week. No one spoke. I had expected Elise to correct, to soften, to remark on my zeal. Instead, she became stiller. That frightened me more. Calm was her native instrument. Extra calm meant she was calculating. At last, she said, You're building a case out of weather and leftovers. Yes, I said, because that is where my wife kept the truth. That landed, not as a blow, as a shift. Even Caleb felt it. I saw it in the way he lowered his gaze to the open cookbook and did not raise it again for several seconds. Elise looked at him rather than me when she answered. Helen kept many things, apparently. That was the first sentence of the evening with a sliver of contempt in it, and because it was so slight, I knew I had finally gotten under her surface. I said. Did you recopy the remembrance menu card? Caleb's head came up sharply. What menu card? Good, I thought. There are still rooms in this house you haven't been brought into. I crossed to the dining room sideboard and returned with the stack of holiday and memorial menus Helen had kept in a shallow silver box because she believed absurdly and rightly that meals disappear faster if no one writes them down. The card I wanted sat halfway through the stack. Cream stock. Helen's hand at the top. Nora Sunday supper. Underneath, in different handwriting from the second line on down, chicken and rice, apple crisp green beans rolls. I handed it to Caleb. He read it once, then again. This isn't Mom's writing. No, I said. Elise said quietly. Many people wrote menu cards in this house. Not for Nora suppers, I said. Caleb looked at her, not accusingly, more terribly than that, like a man trying to locate the moment he first stopped recognizing the furniture in his own memory. Elise spoke to him before he could ask anything. Your mother was tired some years. Yes, I said, and some years she was exact enough to keep score. The kitchen went silent. No appliance noises now. Even the refrigerator had chosen not to intrude. Outside tires hissed once on the wet street and were gone. Then Caleb said in a voice I had never heard from him, not as a boy and not as a man. Did Nora ever ask for cinnamon in the apples? Elise turned to him fully then. I don't know why this matters. His face altered. Answer me. She held his gaze. People remember tastes differently. No. His voice sharpened. Did she? Elise did not answer. And there, in that failure, I saw something I had needed for years without knowing its shape. The precise moment my son stopped borrowing his certainty from her. It did not make him strong, not yet. It made him scared. Which was better. Scared men can sometimes still be reached. Certain men rarely can. He set the menu card down as if it had become too hot. I thought some of that was from her. No one had to ask which her. I said very carefully, from Nora. He looked at me and gave the smallest nod. A new grief entered the room then, and it was not mine first. It was Caleb's. Not the old grief of a young man losing a woman in an accident. Something uglier and more adult. The grief of realizing that what he had been taught to preserve may itself have been arranged to keep him dependent on the arrangement. Elise saw it too. I watched her see it, and what frightened me was not panic but adaptation. She moved one step closer to him, voice lower than before, soft enough that in another room it would have sounded like mercy. Caleb, you were hurt. Those days were fractured. Everyone was trying to help you hold on to what you could. He took a half step back. That half step was tiny. It was also the largest movement in the house. I said, who is Vivian Bell protecting? Elise turned to me without losing calm. This is over the line. No, I said. This is the line. Something cold came fully into her then. Still no speech, no raised voice, no melodrama. Just the disappearance of the kindly administrative warmth she had worn into my house for years. Tom, she said, be very careful. There are families attached to what happened. There are records. There are legal boundaries you do not understand. There it was, at last. Not explanation, not comfort, but warning. Good, I thought. At least now I know what shape your fear takes. I said. Then bring me a record that agrees with my wife. She did not respond. Caleb looked between us as if the kitchen had become a language he once spoke and no longer did. What did Vivian ask you to help with? He said. Elise kept her eyes on me. Practical matters. He repeated louder. What practical matters? At that, she looked at him and her face changed again, not back to kindness, but to something closer to weary superiority. The look of a woman who has spent years rescuing a man from his own uncertainty and resents being asked to describe the rescue in plain terms. Your memory was not usable, she said. Your aunt was drowning. Your parents were trying to keep you fed and vertical. The Bell family needed some discretion. The word hit the room like a stain. Discretion about what I asked. She drew in a breath, then let it out. About confusion that would not have helped anybody then. About the body, I said. Her eyes flicked to me once, only once, and that was enough. No answer would have been more explicit. Caleb made a sound behind me, not a word. I turned. He had one hand over his mouth and the other braced against the counter's edge. For a second I thought he was going to be sick. I moved toward him and he recoiled before he could stop himself. That hurt more than it should have because it proved how completely the house had been rearranged around his mistrust. Not only of me, of any man trying to force sequence where someone softer had once supplied comfort. I stopped where I was. "Elise," I said without looking at her, "go home." She did not move. Now. When she spoke, it was to Caleb, not to me. "You do not have to do this tonight." That was her final move. Not argument. Return route. I turned then and met her eyes. "You don't get to decide what he has to do in Helen's kitchen anymore." For a long second I thought she might refuse. Not dramatically, simply remain and force me into a larger humiliation. Then she gathered her gloves one by one and slid them on with the controlled patience of a surgeon preparing for work. At the doorway she paused. "I did not create the mess you're looking at," she said. "No," I answered. "You translated it." That stopped her for the first time all evening. Then she was gone. After the door shut, Caleb stayed where he was, one hand still on the counter. I waited, not because I had become wise overnight, but because for once I understood that silence could be a strategic kindness instead of a cowardly one. At length he said, staring at the cookbook, "There were boxes in the guest room." "I know. I thought that was temporary. It may have been. She told me Nora's aunt couldn't bear to look at some of it. She may have told the truth once." His throat worked. "I remember the red coat. That got my full attention." He swallowed again. "Not from before. From after. I felt the room narrow around us. After what? The service." He shut his eyes hard, as if forcing memory physically through some scarred internal passage. I thought I was making it up, or dreaming it. I came downstairs one night and saw it draped over a dining room chair. Mom was in the kitchen with the boxes. Elise was there. I remember thinking somebody had brought the wrong thing to the house, and then later I stopped being sure it happened. I leaned both hands on the table because my knees had gone uncertain. Why would Nora's coat be here after the service? He looked at me, and I saw exactly where the boy in him had died. Not in the crash, not in the cemetery, but in the years afterward, when uncertainty became a room somebody else furnished for him. "I don't know," he said. "I didn't ask." I stopped asking a lot of things because every answer came with that look. "What look?" He turned his head toward the front hall where Elise had gone out. "The one that says your pain is already making enough work." That nearly undid me. Not because it was poetic. Caleb has never been poetic. Because it was plain. Plain in the way true family damage usually is, when someone finally names it without trying to sound wounded enough to earn special handling. I sat down. Across from me, the cookbook lay open like an affidavit. "We are not waiting anymore," I said. He gave a small, exhausted nod. That night, after he left with a promise to come back the next afternoon, I called the number Mara had given me for Ruth Bell Mercer. Ruth was Nora's mother's cousin, though I had met her only twice in all the years before the accident, and once after at the service. A hard-faced woman with iron-gray hair and a way of standing at the edge of grief gatherings as if she knew better than to let sorrow make her social. The family had called her difficult. I had believed them because difficult women are often the first ones respectable people agree to misunderstand. She answered on the fifth ring. I gave my name and a stripped version of why I was calling. There was no point in gentleness with a woman like that. She listened in a silence that did not ask for trust and did not offer any. At last, she said, "You're late." "Yes," I said. "So was your wife." I went still. "What does that mean?" "It means Helen called me once, years ago, asked whether Elise had ever had access to Nora's clothes before the service." A short pause. "I told her yes." My hand tightened on the receiver. "Why would she ask that?" "Because she was smarter than you." I almost took offense and then realized offense was a luxury for men not currently being handed their own failures in serial form. "Did Elise have access?" "Yes." "How Vivian gave it." "She said somebody needed to sort things before Nora's mother came apart worse than she already was." Ruth's voice stayed flat, unsparing. "Vivian liked neatness. Always did. Neat stories, neat rooms, neat grieving. She could not stand mess unless it was happening inside somebody else. And Elise liked usefulness." The word carried acid in her mouth. "Liked being the woman who knew where everything belonged." I closed my eyes. "Mrs. Mercer," I said, "did anyone in the Bell family ever question the identification?" "Question?" She gave a dry laugh. "People question things all the time. Families decide which questions have social permission." "Did you?" "Yes. And I was told there'd been confusion at the hospital and that Vivian had handled it." She paused. "Then I saw Elise wearing Nora's scarf 3 weeks later and understood the family had gone past confusion into appetite." The sentence entered me so coldly I had to sit down on the stair just outside the kitchen. "What scarf, grey wool, fine weave. Nora wore it every winter. Your wife asked me about it too." I looked toward the guest room ceiling as if I could see through it to the closets and boxes and bags above. "Do you still have anything?" I asked. Another pause. Then, "One thing. Can I see it?" "If I bring it, I am not doing this for drama." "I know. I'll come tomorrow." When I hung up, the house had crossed into a new territory. Not haunted, not threatening in any childish way. Controlled. The wrong things in the wrong rooms now felt less like accidents of grief and more like the evidence of a domestic system that had once admitted a woman who translated pain into organization and organization into authority. Every room on the first floor had participated in some way. The guest room storing boxes, the dining room sideboard holding mixed papers, the den displaying approved images, the freezer preserving relabeled supper remains, the kitchen absorbing and resisting all of it through Helen's exactness. I went to bed after midnight and did not sleep at all. The next afternoon, Ruth Mercer arrived in a rust-colored sedan with a cracked taillight and a coat that looked older than some marriages. She carried no purse, only a large manila envelope folded once across the middle. Her face was as severe as I remembered, but age had done something useful to it. It had clarified which hardness came from temper and which from endurance. Caleb came 20 minutes after she did and looked startled to find her at my kitchen table with the envelope between her hands like a deck of cards nobody was enjoying. "I'm not staying long," Ruth said before he had fully taken his coat off. "I brought what I kept because decent people around me preferred forgetting to exactness." She slid the envelope across to me. Inside was a note folded around a dry cleaner's claim ticket. I unfolded the note first. 2 lines written in a young woman's hand that I recognized at once from old birthday cards Nora had once sent Caleb when they still believed affection needed paper. The handwriting leaned forward a little too eagerly. The loop on the Y, narrow the T's, crossed lightly, as if she never had time to finish a stroke with conviction. "Vivian says, don't bring the red coat back yet. It needs fixing where the lining split. No date, no signature, none needed. Under it, the cleaner's ticket. Bell's Custom Tailor Grandview. Claim number. Item description, red wool ladies' coat lining repair." I passed both to Caleb. He read them and went white. "This is hers," he said. Ruth nodded once. "Yes." "You're sure?" She gave him a look that would have withered a lesser man. "I am too old to drive across town and gamble on fabric." He stared at the note again. The red coat wasn't hers when she... He couldn't finish. No, Ruth said. It was altered later. Vivian bought it for her after Christmas because she said the old green one made her look washed out. I felt the room sharpen. Later. After Christmas. Which meant the red coat in the photograph could not belong to the version of Nora stored in my family's approved memory unless that version had already been tampered with. Ruth saw me understand and turned to me directly for the first time. Elise had access to Nora's things before the service. Vivian let her. Said she had good hands and a practical head. I thought it was vulgar then and think so now. Afterward, I saw pieces move strangely. The scarf, a pair of gloves, phrases, preferences. Little bits of a girl being carried by the wrong woman into rooms where grief gave nobody the appetite to challenge it. The gloves in the guest room box. The scarf, Ruth mentioned. The note in the cookbook. Nora hates nutmeg. Elise doesn't. How much did Helen know, I asked. Ruth's face did something almost like sorrow. Enough to be frightened by the pattern. Not enough maybe to prove it cleanly before illness took the rest of her time. That was the moment I stopped being a man receiving revelations and became a man arranging for war. Not loud war. Domestic war. The kind fought with sequence witness placement and timing. The kind Helen would have understood better than any of us. I stood and carried the cookbook to the exact center of the kitchen table. Not one side. Not my place. The center. Then I placed around it in deliberate order the photograph from its pages. Mara's card, the transfer copies, the menu card in 2 hands, the relabeled freezer containers, Ruth's note, the Taylor ticket, and Helen's clipping about nutmeg. Each object touched another at one corner, forming not a pile but a chain. The table no longer looked like a grieving man's mess. It looked like a chronology. Caleb watched me do it. "What are you doing?" he asked. I did not look up. "I'm making it impossible for anybody to call this confusion again." Ruth gave the faintest nod. Mara, who had arrived quietly 10 minutes earlier and stood in the kitchen threshold with both hands wrapped around her tote strap, let out a breath I had not heard her take. And there, as the late light from the sink window moved across Helen's stained cookbook pages and touched the corner of Nora's note, I understood with total clarity exactly how Elise Harrow had entered my house and made herself necessary, not through romance, not through force, not through one spectacular lie. Through grief translated into routine. Through labels, recipes, memorial suppers, guest room boxes, copied menu cards, corrected tastes, and the soft authority of the woman who always knew where things belonged. That was the point of no return, because once I knew the method, I also knew the place to break it. In Helen's kitchen, with every room finally forced to answer to the table, that was the point of no return, because once I knew the method, I also knew the place to break it. In Helen's kitchen, with every room finally forced to answer to the table. I did not raise my voice when I asked Caleb to call Elise and tell her to come back the next evening. I did not explain myself to Ruth or Mara beyond the necessary. And I did not, for the first time in many years, let my own need to keep the family from cracking determine the shape of the next day. I let truth set the terms instead. The rest of that afternoon I worked. Not feverishly. Fever belongs to panic, and panic was the luxury of people who still had the option of confusion. I moved through the house with a legal pad in one hand, and Helen's blue pencil in the other, and I wrote down what each room knew. The den knew which photographs had been chosen and which had been withheld. The whole cabinet knew which papers had traveled together and which had been given labels in the wrong hand. The guest room closet knew what had been brought into the house under the name of sorting and then never taken back out again. The freezer knew which suppers had been relabeled to create continuity where none belonged. The dining room sideboard knew which forms had once lain too close to the church acknowledgments and been dismissed as clutter while they still had power to embarrass the living. The kitchen knew all of it because Helen had made the kitchen the only place in the house where sequence could survive sentiment. By the time darkness came down outside the sink window, I had arranged the table in a progression that even I could not mistake for grief anymore. At the head of it sat the cookbook, open to the chicken and rice recipe with Helen's notation, first made this after Nora's service. Caleb ate 2 helpings. February 11th. To the right of it lay Mara's card referencing Sunday night and the casserole. Below that, the clipping with Nora hates nutmeg. Elise doesn't. To the left of the cookbook sat the 2 transfer copies with their inconsistent internal chain. Beside them, the service program and Daniel Reeves' notes in his spare, almost severe script. On the far side lay the menu card in Helen's hand at the shirsh and another hand beneath the later hand, making memory tidy. Near the bottom, Ruth's envelope with Nora's note about the red coat and the tailor's ticket. And above it all, slightly separated the 2 photographs, Caleb on the porch and Caleb with Nora in the red coat. A chronology is not just a way of organizing facts. It is a moral decision. You place one thing beside another and refuse to let either escape its relation to the rest. I had spent most of my adult life teaching young people that sequence matters because cause matters. It took me 68 years and a dead wife to understand that the same is true inside a family. Ruth stayed for supper, though none of us called it that. Mara made tea she barely touched. Caleb sat at the table and looked at the evidence the way men look at the aftermath of a car accident. They know their names are somewhere inside. He said almost nothing. Once, after a long silence, he picked up the menu card and stared at the line where someone else had rewritten what Nora liked to eat, then put it down so gently it broke my heart a little. When Ruth left, she paused in the front hall and said to me, "Vivian will deny the shape of this before she denies the details." "I know." "No," she said, turning her coat collar up. "I don't think you do. Some people can survive shame. Some people are built out of the prevention of it." Then she was gone into the cold. I did not sleep that night either, but it felt different. Not because I was calmer, because I had crossed from being acted upon into choosing my terms. I sat in the den for an hour after Caleb drove back to his apartment and looked at the memorial shelf. The silver frame with Nora's graduation photograph sat where it always had, catching the lamplight on one corner. Behind it, I knew now there had once been another image. Not because Helen forgot to tidy, because she was separating what could be looked at publicly from what could only be endured privately, until she knew more. I took the silver frame down. On the back, under the little folding stand, was the label with Helen's hand, Summer 2006. Below it so faintly I had missed it the day before, another pencil line mostly rubbed away. Not this one. It was nearly gone. Perhaps she had started to write more and thought better of it. Perhaps she did not want even herself to leave a sentence too direct. I stood there in the den with the frame in my hand and felt my wife's intelligence pass through me like weather. All those years I had loved the warmth of her, the steadiness, the droll patience, the way she made a room seem more legible by entering it. I had not honored enough the fiercer thing beneath all, that the part of her that noticed pattern and refused false ease. I had mistaken the practical for the gentle. I had not understood that her routines were not quaint domestic habits. They were her ethics in action. That understanding hurt more than any revelation Elise had handed me, because it made my failure intimate. The villainy in my house had required a manipulator, yes, but it had also required a husband who heard his wife's sharpness and filed it under mood. The next morning I called Daniel Reeve and asked if he would come to the house that evening. He did not ask why. He only asked who would be present. "Me," I said. "My son." "Mara Vance, Ruth Mercer, if she agrees, Elise Harrow, and family council," he asked dryly. I taught high school, not corporations. A faint sound on the line that might have been approval. "Very well. I will come for 1 hour. No more." Then I called Ruth and Mara. Both said yes. I did not call Vivian Bell, not because I was afraid of her, because she was not the one who had translated the lie into my home. Her reckoning would come another way. This one belonged to the woman who had used our grief as a domestic system, and to the son I had failed by leaving him inside it. The longest call was Caleb's. He answered immediately, which startled me more than I wanted it to. "Dad, I need you here by 6. A pause. "I will be. And I need you to stay." Another pause. "Then I know." That was all. But the fact that he said it without argument felt like a small, clean thing in a house that had not had many lately. I spent the afternoon cooking. Not because I expected anyone to eat much, because I needed the kitchen to remain Helen's, not become a courtroom dressed in borrowed seriousness. I made the bread she used to make in the last years, the one from the recipe card she kept tucked in the bread section of the church cookbook, but had long since altered beyond recognition. Less sugar, longer rise. Slash the top with a sharp knife, because pretty loaves lie, she used to say, if you don't let them open themselves honestly. I smiled at that while kneading, and then I had to stop and brace both hands against the counter, because for one sharp second missing her was not a background fact, but a force. It is a peculiar thing to grieve someone anew, because you finally understand the work they were doing while you thought they were simply being themselves. The dough rose while I set the table. Not formally. No places. Only chairs where they needed to be. The center left clear except for the evidence. I wiped the counter twice. Put out water glasses, folded one of Helen's blue-striped dish towels, and laid it beside the sink. When the bread came out, the kitchen filled with the smell of flour and yeast and browned crust, and for a moment I nearly lost my nerve. Not because I feared Elise, not because I feared the facts, because there is something almost obscene about asking a house to witness the collapse of a story it has been made to hold for years. I stood by the cooling rack and looked through the doorway toward the den, where the memorial shelf sat in its careful arrangement, and I understood that once the evening began, I would not be able to return the first floor to innocence. Even truth cannot do that. It can only end the impersonation of innocence. Caleb arrived first. He came in without his usual pause at the threshold and went directly to the kitchen table. He had lost something in the previous 24 hours, and though the loss was cruel, I was grateful for one result of it. He was no longer pretending composure meant safety. He looked tired enough to split down the middle and older, somehow, though men do not age in a day so much as shed what has been protecting them from time. He glanced at the bread on the rack, then at the open cookbook. "Mom's loaf," he said. "Yes." He nodded and sat without asking where. Mara came 10 minutes later, carrying no tote. This time only her coat and a face determined not to fail in the same way twice. Daniel Reeve arrived exactly on time, a manila envelope tucked under one arm, his silver watch visible at the cuff. He greeted no one with unnecessary sentiment. Good. Ruth came last, before Elise, taking the chair nearest the hall as if she intended to remain capable of leaving if decency failed the room again. The only empty chair was the one opposite me with the evidence between us. At 6:10 the bell rang. No one moved at first. Then I stood and crossed the hall. Elise waited on the porch in a dark wool coat, gloveless, one hand holding the strap of her bag. She looked less polished than usual, which somehow made her more dangerous. Effort visible is often more convincing than effort concealed. "You've gathered the parish," she said quietly as I opened the door. "No," I answered. "Only the people who are done being corrected for noticing." She held my gaze for 1 second longer than politeness required, then stepped inside. The kitchen changed temperature with her in it, not literally. The heat still pushed from the vent by the radiator. The bread still gave off its warm, yeasty breath, but her presence pulled every kindness tighter. She took in the room quickly, Caleb at the table already half closed around himself, Mara straight-backed, Ruth expressionless, Daniel Reeve not seated as family, but as witness, the cookbook open at the center like an object of worship or accusation. Her eyes touched each element, and by the time she looked at me, she had already calculated what she thought the room was for. "This is excessive," she said. "No," I said. "Excessive would have been waiting another year." She did not take the offered chair immediately. "If this is about the Bell family, they are not represented." Daniel Reeve spoke for the first time. "Miss Harrow, this is not a hearing, it is a chronology." His voice did more than mine could have then. Not because it carried greater authority in some formal sense, but because he had no grief in his mouth for her to lean against. She looked at him, recognized his type instantly, and adjusted. At last, she sat. I remained standing. That was not planned. I discovered only as the evening began that I could not bear to conduct it seated like a man petitioning his own table. I placed my hand on the open cookbook. My wife, I said, left no letter, no tidy explanation. She left routine. And because she left routine, the rest of you are going to answer to sequence, not tone. No one interrupted, not even Elise. I started with the smallest things because lies built through domestic management are undone best by what they once counted on people dismissing. I lifted the soup clipping. Nora hated nutmeg. Helen wrote that. She also wrote that Elise did not. It is a small distinction until you place it against a pattern of remembrance meals where Nora's supposed preferences changed. I set it down and took up the menu card. This heading is Helen's hand. The meal written beneath it is not. Somebody recopied what my family was supposed to understand as Nora's supper. Somebody taught this house a dead woman's tastes by substitution. Elise opened her mouth. I raised one finger without looking at her. You can speak when sequence requires you. It was the first truly satisfying thing I had done in months, and because it was satisfying, I distrusted it immediately. Satisfaction can slip too easily into cruelty. I breathed once hard and kept going. I picked up the 2 freezer labels. My wife used blue painter's tape. Later, containers were relabeled in a different hand, using a different tape, while her own dispenser remained in this kitchen. That means continuity was manufactured after the fact, not memory. Manufacture. Now Elise did speak. That proves someone relabeled leftovers. Yes, I said, turning to her at last. Exactly. And the kind of person who relabels a remembrance supper in another woman's house does not get to hide behind the scale of the object. Small control is still control. For the first time, a flicker of open annoyance crossed her face. I moved next to the photographs. Porch first, then the red coat. These came from the same sequence. One was hidden behind a memorial frame, the other was hidden in Helen's cookbook. The album page where they once belonged has the corners empty and one caption partly erased. I laid the album open to the shadowed squares. That means someone removed them because they did not belong to the family story being displayed in the den. Caleb was staring at the porch photograph so hard I worried he might leave the room without moving. I said his name. He looked up slowly. You remembered the red coat in the dining room after the service. His mouth tightened, then loosened again, as if even the muscles there had to relearn honesty. Yes. Say it for the room. He swallowed. I came downstairs one night after the service. Or maybe after the burial. I didn't know then. I thought I knew. The red coat was on one of the dining chairs. Mom was in the kitchen with the boxes. Elise was there. He stopped, breath catching. I remember thinking it was wrong that the coat was in the house. And then later, when I tried to remember the week, that memory always came with something else. Someone saying I was mixing nights up. Someone saying I hadn't slept. Someone saying grief turns everything into pieces. He did not have to look at Elise when he said someone. Nobody in the room needed help placing it. Elise's voice, when she answered, was still controlled, but something thinner ran under it now. Because you were mixing nights up, Caleb. You were concussed. Your memory was fractured. We were trying to help you by doing what I asked, by telling him which pieces belonged where, until he mistook arrangement for memory. That is grotesque. No, Ruth said from the far end of the table, and her dry voice cut through the room like a blade on porcelain. What was grotesque was letting you wear a dead girl's life into other people's houses because it made disorder easier to survive. Elise turned to her sharply. You have always wanted a scandal more than a family. Ruth did not flinch. And you have always wanted a family more than you wanted your own name. That landed harder than anything else so far. Elise's face changed not into panic, not yet, but into something exposed enough to show the architecture beneath the calm. Not madness. Hunger. A lifelong, reasonable-looking hunger to be the necessary woman in the room. I did not let the silence soften. I lifted Ruth's note and the tailor ticket. Nora wrote that Vivian told her not to bring the red coat back because it needed lining repair. Ruth confirms the coat was acquired after Christmas, later than the season my family was taught to connect to the official burial story, which means the photograph of Caleb with Nora in the coat belongs later than we were all allowed to place it. Mara made a small sound in her throat. I knew without looking that she was crying quietly, the way practical women do when they are angry with themselves for still having tear ducts. Daniel Reeve opened his envelope and slid out the copy. He had brought a cleaner version of the discrepancy notation than mine, plus one additional page. He laid them on the table with the precise tap-tap of a lined paper. I contacted a former county records clerk this afternoon, he said. Not for a full investigation, only to confirm the kind of discrepancy we're looking at. He touched the added page. The internal chain was not reconciled cleanly. A provisional identification chain was replaced before final disposition, but the attached note does not document the reason beyond family verified. That is not how a careful file is supposed to close. I felt the room stiffen around that. Elise said too quickly. That does not mean the burial was fraudulent. No, Reeves said. It means the file was made to discourage questions, the exact phrase from his office. It carried even more weight in my kitchen. Caleb looked from the paperwork to Elise and back again. Did Vivian identify the body? Elise did not answer. Did she? He said louder. Your aunt handled what needed handling, Elise said. I heard my own voice before I knew I was going to use it. Answer the question. She turned to me, and there it was. At last, the edge beneath years of smoothing. You are not entitled to demand my answers in a story that began long before you understood it. That could have broken me 2 days earlier. It did not now, because for the first time I saw the sentence clearly for what it was, the moral vanity of a person who confuses managing damage with ownership of it. I leaned both hands on the table and answered in a voice so calm I frightened myself. When you translated that story into my wife's kitchen, you made me entitled. No one moved. I went on. You entered this house under the name of help. You carried in boxes that should have been family business. You corrected preferences that were not yours to correct. You relabeled remembrance suppers. You recast meals and objects and photographs until my son was grieving inside something you had arranged. You may not have created the original lie. You did something meaner. You made it livable. The words came without shouting and without strain. That mattered, because rage can be dismissed as emotional truth only. Precision is harder to survive. For the first time, Elise's mask did more than crack. It failed to return at once. You think you know what those weeks were, she said. You have no idea. Nora's mother was sedated half the time. Vivian was trying to keep everything from collapsing publicly. Caleb barely knew his own name. Helen was holding pans and forms and phone trees together with both hands. There was no clean way through. No, I said. There rarely is. She stood abruptly, not because she meant to leave, because sitting had become more vulnerable than motion. There was confusion at the hospital, she said. There was uncertainty about identification before the aunt stepped in. There were belongings moving between locations. There were decisions made because everyone believed a faster certainty would do less damage than prolonged ambiguity. That is what happened. It was the closest thing to a confession we were likely to get, not theatrical, not full, not noble. A justification shaped like practicality, Daniel Reeve said. And who authorized the replacement chain? She looked at him with pure dislike. You know as well as I do how families bully paperwork after a death. Yes, he said, which is why decent people resist them. That struck her harder than anything I had said. Caleb had gone very pale. His voice, when it came, was rough with something deeper than grief. Was it Nora? No one answered him. He asked again, and this time the room itself seemed to contract around the question. Was the body Nora's? Elise looked at him, and for the first time since I had known her, she appeared not useful, not composed, not even hungry, merely tired and unwilling to relinquish power without one last attempt to make refusal sound like mercy. You buried someone your family was told was Nora, she said softly. Caleb recoiled as if she had struck him. Mara covered her mouth. Ruth closed her eyes once very briefly. Reeves stayed still as carved wood. I felt not dizziness, but a violent reordering of weight inside my chest. All these years the family wound had been large enough, young death-damaged son, a grave, a service, a shelf. And now even that most brutal simplicity had been denied us. Not necessarily because the body was someone else entirely, though God knew the possibility was already in the room, but because certainty had been replaced by a managed claim and then taught back to us as settled fact. Caleb said, "And you knew?" He did not sound angry now. He sounded hollowed. Elise's answer was almost inaudible. I knew there had been doubt. Did Mom know? That question moved through me like a blade because it was the one I had been asking in different forms since the cookbook opened, and because hearing it from him meant he had arrived in the same room of pain I had. Elise hesitated. That was answer enough. But I made her say it. Did Helen know Elise looked at the cookbook, not at me? She knew enough to be difficult. I do not think I have ever despised another human being more than I despised her in that second. Not because she called my wife difficult, because she did it with the old dismissive cadence of every person who ever treated a woman's exactness as a personality problem. I straightened slowly. No, I said. Helen knew enough to stay human in a room full of convenience. The sentence came out so quietly that everybody heard it. I picked up the cookbook and held it for the first time, not as evidence alone, but as the thing it had always been, Helen's object. Stained, annotated, thumbed, repaired with clear tape at the spine, holding years of meals and substitutions and weather and guest counts and small-lived truths. I laid it back down in front of Elise. This book is what my wife had left when everyone around her wanted tidiness more than sequence, I said. She did not leave me a dramatic clue because she was not a dramatic woman. She left me routine. She left me dates. She left me every ordinary thing you tried to use and thought too small to fight back. Elise laughed then once, and there was nothing gentle in it. Routine. You want to sanctify casserole notes into ethics because it makes this feel cleaner. Helen kept lists because lists were the only way she knew to matter. Caleb made a sound, and Mara gasped as if struck. I think that was the instant Elise lost any remaining hope of retaining the room, not because the insult was flamboyant, because it revealed her final contempt. She had always believed usefulness entitled her to moral superiority over the grief she managed. I answered before anyone else could. Helen mattered, I said, because she was exact when exactness was expensive. You matter only where confusion pays rent. No one breathed. Then Caleb stood up so suddenly his chair legs scraped hard against the floor. All these years, he said, staring at Elise, as if the sight of her had become physically difficult. You were giving me memories I could live with. She opened her mouth. He cut her off. No, I'm not asking. He looked at the cookbook, at the photographs, at the red coat note, and then at me. There was terror in his face, yes, but also something else, something I had not seen directed toward me in years, trust under construction. I let her, he said to me. I let her tell me which pieces fit. I knew some things didn't. I knew the coat was wrong. I knew some meals weren't right. I knew Mom went quiet whenever Elise said Nora liked something I couldn't remember her ever touching. And every time I got close to asking, it was easier to let the answer come already arranged. The shame in his voice was terrible, but the honesty in it steadied the room. I said, "That is over." It was not absolution. It was a line. He nodded once hard and turned back to Elise. You're done in this house. She looked then finally as though she understood she had lost the only witness she most needed. Not me, not Mara, not even Daniel with his records. Caleb, the injured man whose uncertainty had made her indispensable. Her face did not crumple. Women like Elise do not crumble in public unless they know pity will buy them something. Instead, she went flatter, cleaner, more frankly cold. "You are making a family myth out of administrative failure," she said. "If you want to tear open every old wound in the Bell family because your wife hoarded menu codes, do it. But do not flatter yourselves that truth is going to arrive in a white dress because you have an audience." Ruth stood then, slowly, one hand on the back of her chair. "No," she said. "It arrives looking exactly like this. Late, unwelcome, in a kitchen where the wrong woman finally runs out of tone." Elise grabbed her gloves from the table. I said, "Sit down." She looked at me with open contempt now. Or what? This was the point on which years turn. I knew it while it was happening. Men like me, quiet, useful, decent late to clarity, are often expected to fail here. To either soften or explode. To choose passivity or ugliness. Helen deserved neither. So I stood where I was and answered with the full weight of my own house behind me. "Or you leave, now," I said. "And when you walk out that door, you do it knowing every person in this room will speak plainly from this point forward. Daniel will provide his discrepancy notes to County Council. Ruth will state what she knows about Vivian's handling of Nora's effects. Mara will tell exactly how papers and mailings were mixed in this house after the service. My son will give a statement about the timeline he was coached into living inside. And I will tell anyone who asks that my wife spent her last years trying to hold sequence against the lie you made domestic. That is what happens." Elise's hand tightened around the gloves. I went on because after so many years of letting comfort negotiate with truth, the sound of my own plainness felt like justice. You do not get to leave here protected by being useful. You do not get to call Helen difficult one more time in the house she kept honest. And you do not get to stand in front of my son and offer him one more gentle path back into confusion. That part is over. No one interrupted because there was nothing left to smooth. Elise looked at Caleb. He did not look back. She looked at the table, at the cookbook, at the blue pencil laid beside it, at the evidence that had once been too small to count on and had now become impossible to dismiss. Then, because some masks collapse not into drama but into revealed habit, she said in a voice stripped almost clean of affect, "Vivian asked me to help because nobody else could stand the mess. It was not the whole truth. It was the truest thing she had offered," Ruth said, "and you enjoyed being the answer to it." Elise did not deny that either. She left without another word. The door closed. Her car started outside a minute later. Then the street took her away. No one moved. The house had gone so still it seemed to be listening to its own pulse. Daniel Reeve was the first to stand. He gathered his papers into a stack with the same precise taps and looked at me not unkindly. "I will make the appropriate calls tomorrow morning," he said. "Do not expect speed. Do expect resistance." "I do." He gave the smallest nod. "Good." At the hall he paused. "Your wife was exact," he said. "That is a form of courage people often appreciate too late." Then he left. Ruth stayed another 10 minutes, long enough to write down 2 names from the Bell side of the family, who she said might confirm chain of custody pressure if asked in the right order. She did not hug anyone. Thank God. At the door she looked at Caleb and said, "You were injured, not guilty." Then she looked at me and added, "Late is not the same as useless. That was as close to blessing as a woman like Ruth Mercer would ever offer." Mara cried properly only after Ruth had gone. She sat at the table with one hand over the cookbook's lower corner, as if afraid it might disappear, and the tears ran down her face in a tired, almost angry silence. "I should have stood with her," she said. "Yes," I answered. She nodded, because what else could she do with a true sentence? "But you're standing now," I said after a moment. That made her cry harder. When she finally left, promising not comfort but calls in the morning, the house held only Caleb and me. He had not moved far from where he stood after Elise left. He looked at the den doorway, as if the room beyond it might still try to argue with him. I said, "Come help me." He turned. "With what, the shelf?" We walked into the den together. The room looked the same as it had every evening for years, and nothing like itself. The memorial shelf under the lamp now appeared obscene in its neatness. Not because photographs of the dead are obscene, because arrangement without honesty is. I did not tear anything down. Rage damages too much that belongs to the innocent. Instead, I lifted each object carefully. Helen's wedding photo first, the ceramic cardinal, the sympathy card from my department, Nora's silver graduation frame. I set them one by one on the blanket I had laid across the coffee table. Caleb watched me, then stepped forward and took the frame from my hand before I could put it down. He turned it over, saw the label, and then the almost erased pencil beneath it. "Not this one," he read. My throat closed. Yes. He stood there a long moment with the frame in both hands. Then he said quietly, She knew enough." I answered. He nodded without looking at me, and I was angry with her for years. There was no comfort available for that, so I did not offer any. Comfort had done enough damage in this family under false management. I said only I was worse. I explained her to herself. That made him raise his eyes to mine. We stood there in the den with the shelf half cleared and the coffee table full of the dead and nearly dead versions of truth, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, neither of us chose the sentence that would make the next 5 minutes easier. He said, "I thought you preferred things simple." I let that land where it belonged. I did. And now I prefer them true. Something moved in his face then. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But perhaps the beginning of a room in which it might someday be able to stand up. We finished clearing the shelf together, not emptying it completely. Reclaiming is not the same as purging. Helen's photograph went back, but not in the center. She had hated being made emblematic. The cardinal stayed because Ruth and Kevin had meant it kindly. Nora's graduation photo stayed too, but without the silver frame and without the sentimental caption it had lived under for years. We set it plain against the wood until we knew what could honestly be written. The rest, duplicate print service programs, copied acknowledgments went into a banker's box for the inquiries Reeve had promised to start. By the time we returned to the kitchen, the bread on the rack had gone cool. Caleb stood over it with a look I knew from his childhood, though it had been missing from him a long time, uncertainty not yet armored into distance. "You made Mom's loaf." "Yes." Why, I thought about answering because the house needed one ordinary good thing after so much. But that was not quite it. Because this kitchen wasn't going to become hers, I said. He nodded, and something like gratitude passed over his face so quickly it almost escaped being seen. I cut the loaf. Steam no longer rose, but the center was still tender. I put 2 slices on plates and set butter between us. We did not toast it. Toast would have made it another meal, another transformation. We ate it plain and warm enough. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was crust breaking. Then Caleb said, "What if we never know for certain I knew what he meant? The body, the chain, the burial, the terrible gap between legal certainty and moral truth." "We may not," I said. He stared at the butter dish. "How do you live with that?" The question came from the boy he had been after the accident, the one who thought survival would eventually be rewarded with clarity if he behaved well enough. "You stop pretending uncertainty gives liars equal rights," I said. "And you stop letting the lack of perfect knowledge keep you loyal to what was arranged." He was quiet. "That sounds like something Mom would say." "No," I answered. "Your mother would have said it better." The corner of his mouth twitched. The expression almost became a smile, and then knew better than to overclaim. The calls began the next morning and continued for weeks. Daniel Reeve did what he promised: county council, records review, the funeral home's archive packet, a retired clerk who remembered the storm week and the pressure around one family's insistence on speed. Nothing happened in the satisfying velocity of television or scandal. Forms moved, statements were requested. Words like discrepancy chain and misidentification were used without anyone pretending they repaired what their existence implied. Ruth gave her account in the dry, unsparing way only the guilty and the innocent both find difficult to endure. Mara provided what she knew about the mixed mailings, the papers on the sideboard, Helen's questions. Caleb gave a statement that took 3 tries, because each version brought him closer to admitting how much of his adult memory had been scaffolded by a woman who knew how to turn his uncertainty into dependence. He did it anyway. Vivian Bell, as Ruth predicted, denied shape before detail. She denied pressure, denied sequence, denied that anyone had been trying to keep public shame from attaching to the family during the worst week of their lives. Then, when confronted with specific chain inconsistencies and witness accounts, she retreated into the language of overwhelmed relatives and administrative confusion. It may even have been partly true. Most efficient lies are built around one decent fear. In Vivian's case, I think the decent fear was that Nora's mother would not survive prolonged ambiguity. The indecent part was what she allowed that fear to justify afterward. As for Elise, she lost her footing faster than I expected once usefulness no longer protected her. No one arrested her from my kitchen doorway. No detective performed justice for my emotional convenience. Instead, the more durable thing happened. Her authority over our story ended. Her access ended. Her version lost its room. The statements about relabeling copied menu cards, unauthorized handling of personal effects, and participation in the suppression of identification uncertainty did not make her a gothic criminal. They made her what she was: a morally frightening woman who had lived on small appropriations of the vulnerable until enough of them accumulated into a life. I changed the locks after all. Not because I thought she would come back in the night prowling around my freezer labels like some cheap thriller villain, but because the house had the right to know when access ended. There are practical gestures that carry moral force because they redraw the map. Standing in the front hall with the locksmith handing over the old brass cylinders, I felt something unclench in the wood around me. Spring came slowly, and with Ohio's usual bad manners, the maples outside the sink window put out those first indecisive buds like pencil tips. The side yard softened. The garage smelled of wet cardboard and oil again. Mara began bringing peonies instead of apologies. Ruth did not come often, but when she did, she sat in the kitchen instead of the front hall and once even accepted coffee without making it seem like capitulation. Daniel Reeve sent one short note after the preliminary review concluded formal certainty. Unlikely procedural concern, confirmed false finality, exposed. It was not victory language. It was the kind of sentence a decent old man writes when he knows facts cannot resurrect proportion. Caleb started coming on Sundays again. Not every Sunday. Life is not that eager to symbolize its own repair, but enough that the house noticed. At first, he still hovered at thresholds. Then he began carrying things in from the car without asking where they went, because some habits return before trust is brave enough to speak. He cleared the sideboard one afternoon without comment. Another day he went into the guest room closet and came down with 2 bags of old linens and the last of Nora's things we were not required to keep for the inquiry. We packed them carefully. No ceremony, just respect. One rainy afternoon in May, we sat on the floor of the den with the banker's box between us and went through the photographs, not for proof now, but for honesty. Some we kept, some we sent where they properly belonged. The silver frame stayed empty for weeks until Caleb finally said, "Use the graduation one, but no inscription this time." So we did. Plain photograph, plain frame. No curated caption pretending certainty where only love could be rightly claimed. The kitchen changed back first, though not into what it had been. I cooked more. Not because grief had lessened into appetite, but because the room no longer felt like a battlefield waiting to resume at any object. Helen's cookbook lived on the counter now instead of being tucked away after use. That mattered. For months after the confrontation, I could not put it back in the drawer. It had earned the light. Sometimes I still caught myself touching the spine with my thumb the way she used to, as if one more correction might be hiding there. Sometimes there was none. That was its own lesson, too. One Sunday in June, Caleb arrived carrying a paper sack from the market and said awkwardly, "I brought flour." I looked at the sack, then at him. "That sounds ominous." "It's for bread," he said. "If you want." I did not answer right away because I understood what he was actually offering and did not want to make him regret it by naming it too soon. So I said, "All right." We made the loaf together. Not gracefully. He over-measured salt because he was watching the window while he poured. I told him his mother would haunt him for it, and he said she would merely note it in the margin and make him live with the evidence. That was the closest either of us had come to laughing together in years. Later, while the dough rose under the tea towel, he stood at the sink and looked out at the side yard. "I keep thinking about that week," he said. "Yes. And how much of it I let become one smooth thing because I couldn't stand the broken parts." I dried my hands on the striped towel. "That's what pain does when somebody useful offers it furniture." He nodded slowly. "I'm still angry at her." "Good." He looked over, surprised. "Not because anger is a final home," I said. "Because it means you know what happened to you." He stood very still, then said, "I'm angry at Mom, too, sometimes." I had been waiting for that and was relieved when it finally came dressed in plain clothes. "So am I," I said. That startled him more than anything else I might have admitted. I went on before he could mistake me. Not because she kept notes, because she carried too much by herself, because she kept trying to hold the line with routine when she should have had backup, because she trusted I would understand faster than I did. He looked at the cookbook on the counter open to the bread pages. "She loved you," he said. "Yes." "She trusted you." "Yes." He swallowed. "She was disappointed in both of us." The sentence hung there. It hurt. It was also, I think, true in ways that do not diminish love. "Yes," I said again. We let that sit without trying to rescue ourselves from it. The loaf baked, the house filled with the smell of yeast and browning crust and a little too much salt. Rain moved across the sink window in diagonal threads. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard gave its old complaint and then settled. For a few minutes, the room held no grief larger than flour on the counter and the need to remember the butter. That is the thing people rarely understand about aftermath. Justice, even when it comes honorably, and enough, does not create a clean new life. It creates space in the old one where falseness no longer has right of way. The scar remains. The work changes. Later that evening, after Caleb had gone and the loaf sat half-eaten under Helen's old linen towel, I opened the cookbook again. The chicken and rice page still bore the note that had started all of it. First, made this after Nora's service. Caleb ate 2 helpings. February 11th. For months, I had left it untouched, as if adding anything would constitute an intrusion on Helen's hand. But I understood by then that reverence can become another form of cowardice when it refuses completion. She had left me routine not because she wanted to be obeyed forever, but because she trusted I might someday learn to continue it honestly. I took up her blue mechanical pencil. My hand shook once and then steadied. On the line beneath her note, smaller than hers because my handwriting has always looked as if it expects interruption, I wrote, "Date confirmed against Mara's card." Supper followed service, not certainty. I stopped there. No sermon. No claim larger than the facts and the wound could bear. I set the pencil down and looked at the page for a long time. The kitchen around me was quiet in the right way. Not the silence of a house holding back a lie. The silence of work set down for the evening. Through the window above the sink, the yard had gone blue with that late summer dusk that makes even ordinary grass look briefly noble. The loaf sat on the rack, one cut face turned toward me. Helen's dish towel hung over the oven handle. The sugar bowl caught a strip of fading light. Somewhere out in the street, a bicycle passed with its faint chain whir. And then there was only the refrigerator's low hum and the cooling tick of the stove. A week later, Caleb came on a Tuesday instead of Sunday. He let himself in with his own key, which still moved me more than I expected, and carried a small flat box from the hardware store. He set it on the kitchen table. "What's that A frame?" he said. "For the note." "What note?" He did not answer with words. He just reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded card. It was one of Helen's old recipe index cards, blank on one side, and on the other a line in her hand that must have been torn from some draft or planning note years before: "Use what is true and feed who is here." I stared at it. "Where did you get this?" "Back of the bread tin," he said, "behind the yeast packets." "Of course." I sat down because suddenly standing seemed too ambitious. She wrote that he said unnecessarily. "Yes." We were both quiet. Then he added, "I thought maybe we keep it here." I looked at the frame. "Simple wood, no flourish." "Good." "Yes," I said. "We placed it on the small shelf by the pantry wall, not in the den, not on the memorial shelf. In the kitchen where it belonged, among grocery slips and timers and ordinary things that do not call themselves sacred while doing sacred work." By September, the first floor of the house had settled into its changed truth. The den was no longer a curated grief room. It was once again a room with books, a chair, a lamp, and a few photographs placed without performance. The hall cabinet held batteries, envelopes, and only the copies of records still needed for the inquiry. The guest room closet lost its grocery bags of unresolved history and regained its boring linens. The freezer held stockberries and one plainly labeled container of soup. No Nora suppers, no relabeled continuity. The dining room sideboard was just a sideboard again. Only the kitchen kept all its layers, and even there the feeling had changed. Not innocence, dignity. Autumn arrived with the first truly cold evening in October, the kind that smells faintly of leaves and furnace dust when the heat kicks on for the season. Caleb came for supper that night. We did not discuss the inquiry, which was still proceeding in slow official language. We did not discuss Elise, who by then had become a name that no longer had permission to organize anything in this house. We ate roast chicken and green beans and bread from the freezer, and afterward he stayed at the table while I washed dishes. When I finished, I dried my hands and came back to the table. He was looking at the cookbook. "You use it all the time now," he said. "Yes, more than before." "Yes." He nodded. "I used to think it was just Mom." I sat down across from him. "It is." "No," he said, and for once he did not retreat from finishing the thought. I thought it was just one of the things she left behind, like the sugar bowl or the dish towels. But it was how she thought. I looked at him then and saw with a force that nearly took my breath that the truest justice I was likely to get might already be sitting across from me. Not because a case had been opened, not because discrepancies had been confirmed, because my son had finally learned to read the language his mother wrote her life in. "Yes," I said. "It was." He touched the edge of the page lightly, not the writing itself. "I wish I'd known sooner." "So do I." We let that sit between us without trying to smooth it. Then he said, "You knew sooner than I did." I almost denied it out of habit. Then I didn't. "No," I said. "I was just older when I failed." He looked down at the table and laughed once through his nose the way he used to as a teenager when I'd managed to surprise him into honesty. "That sounds like you. It sounds like your mother." At that, he smiled properly, briefly, and then let the smile go before it became disrespectful to the room. That too felt like healing, not joy. Capacity. Later, after he left, I stood in the kitchen alone and looked around. The house was never going to become what it had been before the cookbook opened. I no longer wanted that. Too much of what I had once called peace had really been unchallenged arrangement. Something had been reclaimed here, yes, but something remained unrecoverable too. Helen was still dead. The week of Nora's service and burial would never become fully legible. My son had spent years carrying grief in a shape partly built by another person's need to be essential. None of that could be undone by statements or keys or plain talking, however necessary all of them were. But the house no longer asked itself to keep quiet for love's sake. That mattered. In late November, on the first truly cold Sunday of the season, I made Helen's chicken and rice casserole again. Not to reenact. To use what was true and feed who was here. The rice went under, not mixed. Celery sautéed separately. Broth and milk, not canned soup. I laid the ingredients out in her order, more from habit than reverence now, which is to say, from the deepest form of reverence. Caleb arrived while it was in the oven, carrying nothing this time but himself. He hung up his coat, washed his hands, and without asking began slicing bread. The kitchen windows had gone dark early. Rain ticked once against the glass and passed. The radiators woke with their old, mild complaint. The room smelled of thyme butter and the brown top of the casserole. On the pantry shelf, Helen's framed card caught a little light. After we ate, after the plates were stacked and the dishwasher started, I opened the cookbook and laid it on the table. Caleb stayed where he was, instead of drifting toward the hall or the door. I turned to the page with Helen's note and the line I had added months before. For a moment, I only looked. Then I picked up the blue pencil. I was not correcting her. I understood that at last. I was answering. Below my earlier line, with Caleb standing quietly on the other side of the table and the smell of warm bread still holding in the room, I wrote one more sentence. Truth does not desecrate love. It was more than Helen would have written, less exact, more vulnerable. Mine. I set the pencil down. The loaf Caleb had sliced sat cooling on the rack beside the sink, one heel already missing. The dish towel on the oven handle still held the faint imprint of my damp hands. Outside, the side yard had disappeared into the kind of November dark that makes a house seem gathered close around itself. And in the window over the sink, instead of one solitary man moving inside old routine, I could see two of us in the kitchen, at last older, chastened, not repaired into anything simple, but still there. Caleb did not look away from the page. Neither did I.